Number 1. I was an exchange student from Malaysia and was placed in Missouri in 2006. They were a family of 4, son and daughter, and they lived somewhere around Webster Groves. They looked nice, warm, and welcoming, but it was all a facade, for they were trying to gain my trust. Coming from a country where all neighbors are practicing a million different religions would kind of desensitize you or make you very aware. I was the latter. The first week was fine, but sometimes I would wake up a little early and find them gathered in the kitchen in a circle around the kitchen table, mumbling and whispering. They'd stop as soon as I entered. It was very disconcerting, but I brushed it off thinking it was an American quirk. During the second and third week, it became worse. The boy wouldn't touch me because I'm born from sin, his words, and the girl was afraid of me because I spoke to the father whilst looking him in the eye. I started prodding her for answers whenever little things that I did, which are normal by the way, like reading before bed, talking directly to the parents, eating a sandwich, would elicit small gasps and hyperventilation. She told me that I have residues of the wicked and that I'm going to hell. She told me about a cleanse and a daily prayer wash. I've seen them singing the same hymns over and over again, reciting the same verses in different tones, and it really freaked me out. I wasn't stupid. I realized I was in a cult when they took me to church. I was made to sit in the front, and the pastor was conducting the service specifically for me. I realized it when I looked around and saw that everyone was looking at me. I felt like I was in a horror movie. Wide-eyed, silent stares. Men and women were separated. People wore different colored ribbons on their wrists, and the children looked haunted or just plain frightened. Nobody spoke to me or even came close to me. The men never looked me in the eye, and the women whispered and shunned me. I went there twice. School was on break, so I had to stay in with them. Many weird things happened, but none was as bad as waking up in the middle of the night to find the mother sitting next to my bed, reciting verses from the Bible in the dark. As soon as I'd awake, she'd stop and silently walk away. The family began treating me badly after that. I was punished for being out of line. No dinner, locked in till morning, no sweet drinks. I had to cover up with long sleeve tops, long pants or skirt, etc. I think I only lasted because I was curious. They probably thought since I'm from Southeast Asia, I must be quite gullible and naive. They tried brainwashing me about how sinful I was, how lost I was, how the world is going to end and I'll be dragged into hell unless I accept their teachings. I was there for a month before our chapter coordinator came by for a visit. I told her everything, outside the house naturally, and I left with her immediately. We came back with a group of people from the exchange organizations about an hour later and found them in the midst of burning the things of the sinful non-believer. Thankfully, my passport and other relevant documents were untouched. I never found out what kind of cult they were. Number 2. I want to try to be concise and still give a proper breakdown of my time growing up in a cult. I'm going to start by breaking down the ideology. Second coming of Christ. They believe the second coming is, or was, alive. He was a Korean man who went by the name of Reverend Sun Myung Moon. He was given the mission by Jesus in a vision when he was 16 years old on a mountaintop, and it is his purpose to create an example of the ideal family so all may shape their families in its likeness and create an ideal world. Restoration of the fall. Jesus forgives your sins, but what about restoring humanity to what it was before the fall by paying spiritual indemnities and cleansing humanity of those sins in the first place? Their idea of indemnity is almost like paying karma forward. You can put yourself through misery to either pay for past mistakes of humanity or to ensure good things will happen in the future. You can pay indemnity by 1. Living in a van for years and years on one of their task force fundraising by selling candles or wind chimes, sometimes more than 14 hours a day. 2. Getting an arranged marriage after abstaining from absolutely any contact with the opposite sex all of your life by the Reverend himself, or now your parents, thereby overcoming the temptation of the fall by denying your desires and obeying the church completely. Actually, this is the most important aspect of the church, that you'll get matched and blessed. Their word for marriage is the only thing that will eventually restore humanity. 3. Converting other members. 4. Doing hundreds or thousands of bows to a picture of Reverend Moon every night for X amount of days. 5. Taking cold showers every day for X days. 6. Fasting. You can drink water for a providential number of days, either 3, 7, 21, or 40. Now note, you must do a 7-day fast before you can get married. 7. Giving money offerings to the church. The church also started charging for ancestor liberation in the last couple of decades. Just like old school Catholics, you pay to have your dear old granddad hoisted out of the pits of hell. Since the church is Korean, they have deep resentment towards the Japanese, and ancestor liberation can be thousands of dollars per person liberated. For Americans, it was a little over 100, I think. 8. Beat yourself to repetitive chants at an approved spirit cleansing event. 9. Or basically denying yourself of any human comfort or need for some time. Some do sleep deprivation conditions. There's a lot else, but I can't keep going. Growing up in the church, there are countless strange rituals in the church. Like on your birthday, you and your whole family have to wake up at 5 a.m., go to your altar of Reverend Moon, say a prayer, and offer food. When the ritual is almost over, the birthday kid usually has to take the food and offer some to each of the family members, and you always leave some on the altar. There are countless stories told to the second generation, or children born from marriages approved by Reverend Moon, since we're supposed to have been born as purely as Jesus without original sins. Stories of members who left the church and immediately got hit by a bus, or became prostitutes and died of ODing, or killed themselves out of guilt. Now Korea in the church is seen as the New Jerusalem, Koreans being the new, chosen people. Every leader in the church is a Korean, despite the religion's heavy unification of world cultures and religions overtones. Koreans often were only matched to other Koreans. None of Moon's kids were allowed to marry anyone other than a Korean. Japanese members have always been the church's cash cow, guilting them into paying more in tithing and overcharging them for everything. Americans got their fair share of that too. The church often comes up with a new ceremony, like a holy wine ceremony, where drinking this new blessed wine, usually juice, will heal you of all your sins that of course you have to pay to get into. Sometimes they just make a big plea for extra money, like their total life offering, which was something like, if you paid the church $16,000, you would never have to pay them for anything again, which was a lie. Some members took out second mortgages on their house to pay these offerings. I will say, in response to people in this thread who ask how someone could fall for this, and how people could stay in it for so long, cults like this never approach it like, hey, a Korean guy is the Messiah, you want to join? They take you through steps, almost like Scientology, but not so clearly defined. The Unification Church was going around in America in the 70s preaching for true love and family values, stuff many people, especially people with Christian backgrounds, can get behind. The church does have heavy Christian influence, so much that the language is the same, but they'll start discussing things with you, like the evils in the world. If Jesus restored the world, then why would there need to be a second coming? We should prepare ourselves for the next Messiah. A Messiah is exactly what we need. How else can we right the wrongs of this world? Once you get them going on that, you just pump them with all the same religious feel-good stuff. God is our Father. God is watching out for you. He wants the best for you. God hurts when you don't do what's right. And eventually God becomes some kind of emotionally sensitive dude you have to coddle and take care of. Then, once your members are pumped, they're living in vans, they're trying to recruit other people. That's when you start with the deeper shit. You know, the Messiah is here. The tension has been building to this moment for literally years. The members are overjoyed and can't wait to do anything this guy says so they can be like Jesus' first disciples. Now, no one thinks they're a victim. They think they're literally saving the world. It appealed to a lot of people who were raised Christian, but were dissatisfied with the contradictions or shortcomings of their parents' religion. Number 3. I was married to a Scientologist. Well, Scientology is weird. It's all-consuming, as most cults are. My ex-husband only knew and associated with people in Scientology. However, all his friends were actually very, very nice and really cool to me. I made a lot of friends through him. I never felt outwardly pressured to join Scientology, but the insidiousness was absolutely there, and I'll get to that. Ex-husband was raised in it. You could say he was a second-generation Scientologist. His parents joined back in the L. R. Ron Hubbard days, and they were in it. They both worked for the church as auditors. They were dirt poor. All of their money went to the church. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. They were so deep in debt, they had no health insurance and no money for anything except rent for their tiny, run-down apartment. That part made me the saddest. They were nice people. Now, I married him back when I was younger, more idealistic and willing to overlook major differences. I was a bit lost myself and really just looking to connect with anyone. I was always atheist and actually really against organized religion, but he always assured me that Scientology was not something he was active in and that it wouldn't be a problem. He wasn't taking any courses at the time we dated and were engaged, so I believed him that Scientology was more like his parents' thing than his. After we got engaged, He started telling me how a friend of his needs some help. She was training to become an auditor, the e-meter thing you hear about, and needed someone to practice on. I declined. He kept asking and insisted that it's just for her practice. It doesn't mean I'm doing Scientology, and that it would mean a lot to him. So I did. And what a silly experience. Honestly, it's just ridiculous. You sit in a room with the auditor, hold these cans. Let me tell you, the rigmarole they use to get the cans set right so they pick up your wavelengths, or whatever they call it, is laughable. Lotion on the hands, squeeze the cans. That didn't work? Go for a walk, drink some water. Lotion again, squeeze the stupid cans. All this over and over until something on the auditor's end says it's all working now, and then you're good to go. I lied through the whole thing. They acted like I made some amazing breakthroughs. I got a floating needle, and then that was it. However, I was then called over and over and over to come back. What the hell? I thought this was a one-time thing to help this chick out. Nope, they were all over me. They wanted 3-hour sessions, days in a row, on weekdays. No wonder Scientologists are all poor as shit. They want you in constantly during work days. I became so disagreeable to them that they actually gave up calling me to get me in. I guess they figured me being married to one of them is enough to eventually get me. The Scientologists on the lower portion of the bridge tend to know nothing about the Xenu stuff. I asked them, and they acted like they'd never heard of it. I guess you don't get to read that tech till way later, a few 100,000 deep. The overriding insidiousness I saw was the learned ability to scam people. I witnessed a Scientologist's own business get taken down by the feds for frauding their clients. Now, the reason I divorced him was because he stole a large sum of money from my account that was not to be touched. It just vanished, and he had nothing to say for it. He opened 2 credit cards in my name and maxed them out. He put me into financial ruin. It was a disaster. Number 4. I was born and raised in a cult, and considered myself a member up until I left my parents' home at the age of 18. The group I was associated with is not well known, but the effects on the members are tragic and undeniable. We were literally brainwashed. We had weekly services with a set program: 3 hymns, prayer, sermonette, hymn, announcements, main message, hymn, prayer. It never altered from that layout. As well, the messages we would hear were often videotaped sermons from maybe 5 main people at headquarters. The topics were extremely narrow: prophecy, the end is coming, self-improvement, all of you suck and you should hate yourselves, setting ourselves apart, don't talk to worldly people, they will taint you. There were many ways in which we were indirectly encouraged to harm ourselves. Many people looked down upon modern medicine and felt that using it was a way of turning away from God, slapping him in the face, making it clear he wasn't needed. I personally knew people who died for their faith, waiting for God to heal them. On the other hand, when any of the main leaders fell ill, they were immediately rushed off to receive medical care. They controlled our diet. We pretty much were kosher, though they denied all influence or association from or with Jews. There were annual days of fasting, and whenever the leadership could scare up enough drama within the members, they would declare a church-wide fast so we could all get closer to God and resolve our issues. We fasted when the church's income was said to be dropping. We fasted when the leaders were ill. We fasted when people died. We had our own personal fasts for the hell of it, or when we felt especially guilty and out of touch with God. Parents were encouraged to get their children involved as young as possible. My parents tell me I started observing the annual fast when I was 3 years old. I remember one year when my brother was 2 or 3. At one point during the day, he just broke down sobbing because he was so thirsty. And yeah, we abstained from food and drink. We got obscenely dehydrated every time. Looking back, I just don't understand how a parent can behave that way. And they were so sex negative, I can't even describe it. We spent so much time and energy frantically thinking, I can't think about sex, that it was all we thought about. It was evil, dirty, wrong, and it would hurt if we weren't married. I literally built up so much fear over it that when I did finally have sex, as an unmarried adult, I had literally developed vaginismus, a sexual pain condition. The cause is often psychological. In my case, being so afraid of it hurting, that it hurt, which further fed into my fear. There was actually an entire message once where one of the leaders took on the subject, "Are we a cult?" And he actually went through a checklist with us. His conclusion that we were a cult, but that it was a good thing. We should be proud, only not. Pride is a sin. We should be pleased. You had to be baptized before a minister would marry you. You couldn't be baptized and marry someone else who wasn't. You couldn't marry outside the church. Some ministers wouldn't baptize you if they thought your only incentive was to get married. There were rampant cases of sexual abuse from the leadership, but we were always too fearful to report it. Always taught that it must have, in some way, been our fault. Traditional gender roles were enforced, i.e., women stay home, pop out babies, cook and clean. Men were to work and support the home. Having children, and lots of them, was strongly encouraged. Be fruitful and multiply, and all that shit. Adoption was frowned upon, even for those who were unable to have their own children. So many families were living in poverty because there was just too many children to take care of. God forbid that any of them have a medical condition that required constant treatment. We were robbed on a regular basis. They called it tithing. Not only did we give 10% of our entire income, but we were also to set a second 10% aside, to be used at a 7-day religious convention of sorts every year. And on every third year, we would give an additional 10% to the church. Imagine losing 20% of your income every year and 30% every third year. Imagine being poor to begin with. Imagine being told you are poor because you have been literally stealing from God by not diligently paying your tithes. Growing up, my favorite thing in the world was going fishing with my 2 older brothers. We lived in a very rural area and would often hike out into the woods to go to various creeks to go fishing. He never really caught anything big in the creeks, but it wasn't as much about what we caught as much as it was about spending time with your brothers fishing. Stereotypically, we always got up way early in the morning on fishing day. We would begin hiking out to whichever creek we were going to and would watch the sun as it stole across the sky. It would be fully light outside as we got to where we were headed to. The scariest thing to ever happen on a fishing trip, of course, happened the first time that we had gotten to a new creek. We had set out that morning, determined to go further into the hills than we normally did. We passed by one or two of our regular fishing spots and kept going deeper and deeper into the woods. We found an absolutely amazing spot. It was thickly wooded, but the creek was huge. It was beautiful and even had a fallen tree stretched out over it. After we determined that it was sturdy enough, the three of us made our way over to the other side of the creek. We sat our stuff out and began to fish. The day wore on, and we weren't really catching anything. The fishing got boring after a bit, so we decided to do something we normally didn't do. Like I said, the creek was huge and it was quite deep too, so we decided to put aside our fishing poles and go swimming in the creek. I really don't know how long we had been swimming when I noticed that our middle brother stopped doing anything and began staring off in the woods. Our oldest brother asked him what was wrong, and he just motioned to the woods. "There's someone out in the woods, watching us," he said. My first thought was that some pervert was out there watching us, but when I followed my brother's finger pointing out towards the woods, those thoughts quickly evaporated. Standing off in the trees was a huge man. It wasn't too dark that we couldn't make out some of his features. He was wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, which struck me as odd as it was pretty warm out. He had a baseball cap on his head that was sitting low over his face. But the most striking feature he had was that he was holding what looked to be a rifle or shotgun in his hand. We weren't sure what to do. Going into the woods, we knew that we were trespassing. We never actually knew whose property we were on, but we did know that the places that we hiked and fished on didn't belong to us. Except up until this point, we had never gotten caught before. Both of us younger boys looked at our brother for instruction as to what to do. He seemed just as worried as we did, though, and didn't give us any direction. He just kept looking at the man standing there and watched. My brother suggested we try and get ourselves over to our stuff, take it, and leave. However, this was daunting because that was the side of the creek the guy was on. We slowly made our way over to our things. However, before we got to shore, an old hag came running out of the woods, shrieking like a freaking banshee. I got startled and fell back into the water, struggling until my middle brother pulled me back up again. The old nasty woman actually ran over to our things, our poles, and our clothes. She started grabbing the things and screaming, "Mine, mine, mine, mine!" She was gathering all of our things in her arms, dropping a few of them when she had too much in her arms. "Hey, stop that!" my oldest brother yelled, and began to try and move faster to the shore. My middle brother reached out and put his hand on his shoulder and pointed back to the big guy in the woods. When we moved back towards the shore, he began moving closer, and he held the gun up as he walked. "Holy shit!" I distinctly remember yelling. "We're sorry we trespassed on your property," my middle brother shouted, but they didn't pay any attention to us. "He's not gonna shoot us," my oldest brother said, and began moving towards the old hag to get his things. As he did, though, the old woman saw him, and she took a fillet knife out of her pocket and started waving it at my brother. "I'll cut you!" she screamed at him, her arms still overflowing with our things. By now the big hillbilly was by the shore of the creek, and he had the shotgun cocked and was pointing it at my oldest brother. He, of course, stopped in his tracks. It was a tense moment as we stood cold in the water with this guy pointing his gun right in our faces. Once the woman had gathered up our clothes and fishing gear in her hands, the guy said one thing to us: "Get." We didn't have to be told twice. All three of us swam to the other side of the creek, got out of the water, and got out of there. It sucks because we had to walk through the woods in nothing but soaked shorts. We didn't even have shoes, and the twigs and rocks and leaves hurt our feet. But we were too scared to even consider going back. We fortunately did not get chewed out for losing our stuff. Our dad told us that there are some messed up people out in the woods, and we had to be careful. It was a long time, though, before we were brave enough to go fishing again.
Growing up, my fraternal twin brother and I shared a room. I think both of us would prefer to have our own room, but our dad used our extra room for a study. He was a lawyer and needed it as his office at home, I suppose. Anyhow, I slept on the top bunk, and my brother slept on the bottom bunk. The worst thing about sleeping on the top bunk is that I tend to have to get up several times a night to go to the bathroom. I guess I must have a small bladder or something. I also drink a lot of pop, which probably has a lot more to do with it. Or it might have had something to do with the fact that my brother tosses and turns all night, and it wakes me up over and over again. One night when I was 15, when I went to bed, I noticed that my brother had already gone to bed. I had originally intended to stay up and read in bed for a while, but couldn't turn my light on if my brother was asleep. Instead, I took my Android up on the top bunk with me and decided to play some games on my Nintendo emulator app. I played an old Dragon Warrior game with the sound off. Right on cue, no less than an hour after I got into bed, my bladder started telling me that I had to get up. So, trying to be as quiet as I possibly could, I put my phone down and got up and went to the bathroom. I did my thing, and then I came back into the room. When I opened the door, the light shone in my room for a second, and it must have bugged my brother a little bit because he grumbled something, flopped over, and was quiet again. I quietly apologized, but he didn't reply. Trying my best to not wake my brother up again, I climbed the ladder back onto the top bunk. I noticed when I got up there that my cell phone light was blinking green, which indicated that someone had sent me a text message. I picked up the phone, wondering who would be sending me a text that time of night. When I tapped the screen, my blood froze in my veins as I read a text from my twin brother that simply asked, "Hey bro, I'm gonna be out late with my girlfriend. Can you cover for me?" At first I thought it was a joke. My brother could have sent the text to me from the lower bunk when I was using the bathroom. It was the sort of thing that he may have done. I slowly texted him back. I thought that if he responded, I'd be able to see the reflection of the light on the wall from his cell phone. I asked him if he was joking. Immediately, he texted back and said, "No, why would you think I was joking?" I didn't see any light. I answered and said that I just saw him sleeping in the bunk below me and that I didn't find this funny at all. The text back from Ian was almost immediate. He told me that it was definitely not him in the lower bunk, and if I was not joking, I had better get out of that room immediately. Scared half to death, I grabbed my phone, skipped the ladder, and jumped off the bed and ran for the door. Despite what might have been better judgment, when I opened the door, I had to look back and see who was sleeping in my bed. Part of me still suspected it was Ian playing a joke on me. However, when the light shone on the bed, it was empty. No one was there. Freaked out and confused, I turned the light on. No one was in the bed. I crept slowly over to the bed and looked under it, half expecting to see a face looking back at me. No one was there. I looked in the closet. No one was there. I guess the fact that there was no one there should have made me not scared, but it was scarier. I ran out the door and went to my parents and explained what had happened. I hated to throw Ian under the bus like that, but if there was an intruder in the house, I thought finding that person was more important. My parents and I searched the entire house, but we didn't find anyone or any indication that anybody had broken into the house. I wasn't able to go back to bed until Ian got home. It was just way too creepy. I never knew what I saw in the bottom bunk that night. All I know is there was definitely someone there.
It's taken me a long time to tell this story. I'm 27 years old now, and this happened to me when I was 14. My name is Adam, and I have one older brother named Seth. I haven't seen Seth in 13 years. I have no idea where he is, or even if he's still alive, but I do know why he left. Seth was 2 years older than me, and we were very close. Although all brothers tend to get into scuffles with each other, with Seth and I, they were few and far between. For the most part, he and I did everything together. He taught me how to fish. He let me play football and baseball with him and his older friends. Although Seth was bigger and stronger than I was, he always sold me to other people like I was superior to him. He told people I was smarter than him. He told them I was the talented brother who was going to be so much more successful than anyone could dream of. I really loved him, and he was easily the best friend I have ever had. Around the time I turned 14, however, Seth began acting very odd. At first, I don't think my parents thought much of it. He was wearing black all the time and seemed like he was really depressed. Rather than hanging out with me or even his friends, he took to spending a lot of time alone in his bedroom. He obviously kept the lights off all of the time as well, because there were no lights coming from under the door. It may have seemed like typical 16-year-old boy sort of stuff, and that is likely why my parents didn't pay it any mind. But I was closer to Seth than they were. I knew him better than they did, and I knew that this was not typical teenage stuff. Hell, I was a teenager at the time, going through a lot of that myself. With Seth, it was something more. I would walk by his room at night, and I would hear him talking to someone. I never heard another voice, and I always chalked it up to the fact that he must have been talking on his cell phone. But the conversations were never pleasant. Whomever he was talking to, Seth was always at odds with that person. Whatever it was that was bothering my brother, he never told me. He never was angry with me either. He would say hello if I greeted him, and he always offered me a friendly, if not extremely worn-out smile. But rather than do anything else or say anything else to me, Seth would immediately go into his room, lock himself in there, and I wouldn't see him again for the rest of the day. After a couple of months of this behavior and no sign of stopping it, I was sitting at my computer doing some homework. I was having a difficult time with it, so I decided to take a break and chat with some friends on Yahoo Messenger. This was long before the days when Skype and Facebook were the norm. I got a message from an unknown user. I don't feel comfortable sharing the real name, so I will just call it Yahoo Stranger 1. This person sent me a message telling me, "If you don't keep far away from Seth, I'm going to kill you." At first, I was too alarmed to say anything, but after I composed myself, I messaged the person back. I told him that Seth was both my brother and my best friend, and I would hang out with him whenever I wanted. The person didn't respond. I kept sending him a message asking who he was, but he only responded, "You've been warned." I wanted to confront Seth about this, but he refused to talk about it. When I mentioned the message to him, there was a little bit of recognition in his eyes, but he just forced a very wary smile, tousled my hair, and told me there was nothing to worry about. He would take care of it. That was the very last time I ever saw my brother. The following day, he didn't come out of his room to go to school. I went up and knocked on his door at my mom's request, but he didn't answer. My parents tried to get him out of his room as well, but the door was locked and he didn't answer. My parents had to eventually pick the lock on the door, and when we went in, Seth wasn't there. What's more is that many of his things were gone, and there was a note on his bed that simply said, "Goodbye." My parents, of course, called the police and went through the whole missing child procedure. But it wasn't until I curiously turned on the monitor to Seth's computer that I got a little bit of information on what was going on. The very first thing I noticed was that Seth's Yahoo Messenger was up, and there was an open conversation. The conversation was with my screen name, and Seth's screen name was Yahoo Stranger 1. It was him that had sent me that message. Seth had also left his cell phone behind. I suppose this was to keep our parents from being able to track him. Remember all those times I thought I heard him arguing on the phone with someone? He had no calls in his history other than from my parents. If he was arguing with someone, it was not on the phone. But the true scariness came from the fact that there was a long and detailed conversation on the Yahoo Messenger. It was between Yahoo Stranger 1 and the screen name that we knew was Seth's. The conversation was horrid. Yahoo Stranger 1 was telling Seth over and over again to hurt me. There were these grisly and disgusting things that the messenger was telling him to do, and Seth's responses were adamant that he loved me and he wasn't going to hurt me. There was a message that night, the one after I told Seth about what had happened, that was the scariest. Yahoo Stranger 1, who I assumed now was Seth, told Seth to kill me. Seth refused and argued with him and pleaded with Yahoo Stranger 1 to leave him alone. I could tell in the messages that the conversation was causing my brother a lot of pain. Trying to figure out how Seth could have been having an instant messenger conversation with himself, I looked at the timestamps of the messages, and each one was at least 5 minutes apart. He had the passwords saved on his messenger for both accounts. I figured he had to sign out and sign on both names repeatedly, answering the messages since Yahoo only allows you to send offline messages. I don't know if Seth is schizophrenic, or if he has dissociative identity disorder, or if Yahoo Stranger 1 really was a different person. But what I am sure of is that the constant threats against me were what was weighing heavy on my brother all those months. And I have no doubt that the reason my brother, my best friend, left was that he was afraid that he actually was going to hurt me. I keep hoping he'll come back one day. He's my brother, and I love him, and I could never be scared of him.
My older brother was one of those people who liked to scare me and my other siblings as much as possible. I couldn't really blame him for it because, although I didn't like being scared myself, I was just as guilty as trying to scare our younger brothers and sisters as well. But kids are allowed to be a little hypocritical, aren't we? The thing that always scared me the most was this big old house that my brother and I walked by every day on the way to and from school. The town we lived in didn't have bus service for any of the kids who lived in the town itself, so we had to walk to school. It was a good half an hour walk. The house that my brother always talked about was a really old Victorian that of course looked like it hadn't been kept up in decades. The lawn was completely dead and there was not anything but brown grass. An old dead tree was in the backyard with a decayed tire swing swaying from it. Old broken bicycles, tricycles, and other contraptions littered the backyard as well. There was an old rusty shed there too. There was never a car in the driveway, and we never saw anyone leaving or entering the place. But we knew that someone lived there because if you walked by in the evening, you could see blue lights shining from behind the curtains as if somebody was inside watching TV in the dark. Whenever the two of us walked by the house, my brother would always make strange comments about what was going on in there. I had to pretend like it didn't scare me, but I was only 12 years old at the time, and I was quite easily scared. He would tell me the man was a butcher who preyed on the little kids in the neighborhood who were stupid enough to walk up to his front door. My brother said the old man would grab the kid, take them out to his shed, hang them from their feet, and then lightly slice their skin open with a fine knife, and then slowly let them die as the blood trickled out into a tub that was under them. Growing up, every time he was in the mood to do it, my brother would dare me to go to the guy's door and break one of the old pots on it. I always declined because I told him I didn't want to get in trouble. He would then make fun of me for being a scaredy cat and taunt me for hours. On Halloween, the year that I turned 12, rather than going trick-or-treating, I was invited to hang out with my brother and his friends. They were doing what we at the time considered mature things. We egged some houses. We lit a flaming bag or two. It was a fun night. Late in the night, my brother and his friends decided to haze the new guy, being me. They dared me to go up to the old Victorian house and break one of the pots on the porch. As much as I wanted to be accepted by my brother and his friends, I did not want to do that, and they taunted me for it. And it was humiliating. But my fear was much stronger than the humiliation, and I continued to refuse to do it. When the taunting got really bad, I angrily blurted out to my brother, Well, if you're so brave, why don't you go do it? My brother hadn't expected that, and it worked perfectly because one of his buddies immediately turned to him and asked him that as well. Suddenly, all the attention was off of me, and it was turned to my brother. He was really taken off guard by the development. Still, my brother had to prove that he had the guts to do it. It was one thing for his little brother to be taunted, but he knew he could never live it down. So, acting all brave, although I could tell he was really scared, my brother walked up to the porch of the old building. You could tell he was scared out of his mind, but he didn't let it show. When he got up the steps, he grabbed an old flower pot and pulled it over his head. As he held the pot above him, proud of himself for what he was doing, I saw the door open behind him. A huge man walked up behind him as he was about to throw the pot. His buddies started screaming at my brother, telling him there was someone behind him. He just looked at us all like he didn't believe us. He just thought that they were trying to scare him. As he dropped the pot on the ground and it shattered, though, the guy grabbed my brother around the neck and held him there. My brother's chicken friends all ran off immediately. I couldn't do that, though. My brother had just been grabbed by a lunatic. I ran up to them before the guy could pull my brother into the house and tried to pull my brother away. The man swatted at me several times. He was huge, and he was choking the life out of my brother. Not knowing what else to do, I realized I had to take the cheapest shot possible. It was the only way I could help my brother. I kicked the guy square in the crotch. He groaned in shock, but he didn't let go of my brother. So I kicked him again, and again. I kicked this huge man a total of 6 times before he finally let go of my brother. Although my brother was wheezing and struggling to breathe, I knew we had to get away from the recently sterilized psychopath, and I pulled him away. It was difficult, but we were able to get out of his yard and down the street before he was able to do anything. Our parents called the police, but get this, they wouldn't do anything about it. My brother was not only trespassing, but he vandalized the guy's porch. We were all shocked and my parents were outraged, but the police did absolutely nothing. This man got away with it. Now, I'm the first one to admit what my brother did was wrong, but the guy was strangling him. Afterwards, my parents drove my brother and I to and from school every day. They figured it was best to avoid the guy as much as possible. The one good thing that came out of this was my brother had a lot more respect for me. It was at least 2 months before he began ragging on me again. But that's how brothers are.
Back in my early 20s, I was trying to kick a major 4-year heroin addiction. Like I said, trying. On my own, which meant that I wasn't using as much and it would be months in between. On this fateful day, someone had given me 2 OC80s. This was when the price of such goodies hasn't reached the almost $100 a piece mark. I had never seen these. They were fairly new on the streets, so after getting off of work at the little coffee shop I worked at, I popped the 2 teeny tiny treats in my mouth and hopped on the train to head into Boston to go see one of my fave punk bands. Now, anyone who knows about kicking a habit, When you start to use less, your tolerance goes down. So number one rule there is use less than you're used to. And I had no idea how strong one of these things were. And like I said, major habit. So of course I took them both. And for those who don't know, one OC80 is enough to let a 200-pound junkie feel good. So being a 110-pound girl that hasn't touched the stuff in a couple of months, I don't even remember the show. Never mind do I know how I got on the train and off at my stop. Anyways, by the time I got to my ratty little borough of Beantown, I was throwing up every 20 feet or so. I could barely keep my eyes open, but I didn't live in a very good part of the city, and curling up on a corner and hoping I didn't die was not an option. So I propped myself up along the walls and was trying to inconspicuously hurl while trying to make the 5 blocks to my apartment. I was about halfway there when I noticed a shitty car going really slow behind me. I figured whoever was in it was looking for a hooker. The part of town I lived in, anyone could be a hooker. So I just turned and looked at him and shook my head. This was usually enough to get them to drive on. It wasn't. Guy pulls right up to me in this like 30-year-old crappy green Honda or something and says in a very thick, what I'm guessing, and please don't tear me apart for not knowing, Korean accent. "You need help? Get in, get in." The man looked to be about 30 and of Asian descent, dressed in jeans, blue tattered t-shirt, and I kid you not, a tux jacket. That has nothing to do with anything. I just thought it strange. Living in Boston, you see some strange stuff. Now, even being a junkie, punk chick, I was always a polite girl who was so nice to strangers as to not hurt anyone's feelings, and because of this, I would get myself into dangerous situations, and I knew this. So I just wiped the puke off my mouth and smiled at the guy and said, "Thanks, but my boyfriend is waiting for me just down the street." There was no boyfriend, and I actually had quite a bit of blocks to cover, but I was nice, not stupid. Well, not that stupid, considering the pill-sickened state I had put myself in. Mr. Man says, "You're sick. You need ride." Okay, guy can't take a hint. I told him again that I didn't need a ride, but thanks. I started to walk faster and cross the street. Unfortunately, it was a one-way, and he pulled up close enough to the curb that he could grab me from the driver's seat. Alright, now I'm getting scared. It's almost 3 a.m. and no one is out on this side of the street. "No, you get in now." I was feeling really sick and embarrassed at this point. I was trying to hold off throwing up in front of this guy, and I know I'm about to hurl again and getting pissed. So I yelled, "No, I know get in now. Look, dude, I'm not gonna suck your dick, so just fucking leave." And then I puked. Now, I was always on the small side and hung around and lived in places where it was a good idea to have some sort of protection. Tonight I had my gravity knife tucked in my boot, so when Mr. Good Samaritan started to get out of his car as I bent over, I pulled it and let the blade slide out as I stood up and said, "Please, just leave me the fuck alone." His eyes focused on the knife, and he got back in the car. Like I said before, his car was a piece of shit, so when he took off, it was really loud. I watched him turn the corner and started back on my wall crawl home. As I turned the next corner, lo and behold, there he was at the end of that street. He took off again when he saw me stop and stand there looking at him. But the whole way back home, I would either see him or hear his muffler. I still hadn't put my knife away, because I knew if he actually got a hold of me, I was in no condition to be able to get him off of me without a lucky stab. He actually drove by me as I was fighting to open the door to my crappy little duplex. My roommate and I lived on the bottom floor, but once I got in, I felt pretty safe enough to crawl to the couch and pass out because my roommate's big-ass skinhead boyfriend was there with her and his pit something mix, who was a love bug, but smart enough to know when not to be. When I finally woke up the following evening, those things hit me really hard. My roommate told me she couldn't believe I had slept through all the ruckus. Apparently the dog had started barking around 4:30 a.m. and wouldn't stop, so they let him out of the room and tried to go back to sleep. But Rudy wasn't having that. They came back out to tell him to shut up, and he was running back and forth between the back corner window and the window behind the couch I was passed out on, which was the actual backside, finally standing on the couch over me and going batshit crazy, acting like he was trying to bite through the friggin' glass without me waking up. My roommate later told me she had checked to make sure I hadn't OD'd and died. This was the point where my roomie's boyfriend decided to go check out what the heck his dog was trying to kill. He grabbed the bat we kept by the door and made his way to the back where the window met the couch. He heard a lot of noise going on the other side. Living in a crappy part of the city, there was a lot of crap around the building. And then a car starting up, a loud car. By the time he ran to the front, the car was halfway down our street. When he made his way back around to check the window Rudy was trying to eat through, there was a bunch of crates to move from under the first window he was barking at, stacked up under the window where the couch was, and the screen had been cut where you put your fingers through to open it. I always read these threads where people say, "I'm getting goosebumps just writing this," and shake my head thinking so overdramatic. And now I feel like an a-hole, because there really is no way to describe how you feel reliving this. Over the next few weeks, the boyfriend and Supermutt stayed at our place because we kept hearing noises, and imagined or not, it scared the hell out of us. Quite a few times the boyfriend would run out when we would hear something, and would sometimes even catch a glimpse of the guy as he went around a corner, but he was never fast enough. Boyfriend would blame it on the guy being ninja fast, but we just knew he was too slow. Some may ask why we didn't just let Rudy out. This was a point in time in my state where they were thinking of outlawing pit bulls. They had a really bad rap. If we had let him out, Rudy would have caught him, and that would just end bad on a lot of levels. But seriously, what kind of person still tries to get into a house with a psycho pit bull and a 6'2" skinhead trying to kill you with a baseball bat? Now you might ask why we didn't call the cops. Well, like I said, I was into some bad stuff, and as a rule, punks don't like cops. However, the neighborhood I lived in, we all talked to each other, and some of them were cop callers. My next-door neighbor knew what was going on and called the cops one night when she heard someone in her kitchen. She lived alone. She locked herself in her bathroom and started yelling that the cops were on their way, but the guy was persistent and was trying to pick the lock from the outside until he actually heard sirens and booked it. The lady said she heard a loud car start and looked out the bathroom window that faced the street to see, you guessed it, a crappy old green car drive away. When I heard about this, I felt really bad. I mean, this lady was like 87 or so and lives alone. What would have happened if that dude got in? Why, oh why didn't we let Rudy eat him? When the cops finally got there, the three of us were outside, so they started asking us if we heard or seen anything, So we told them what had been going on, and I gave a description of who I had thought was doing it, but also said I wasn't sure of details because I hadn't been feeling well at the time. The cop that was writing it down almost threw his pad and pen down, saying that if people like us, punk rock, smarted up and called the police, they could have got this guy. Apparently Mr. Get In Now fit the same description as a guy they were looking for that was wanted for quite a few sexual assaults around the train station. Now I felt really bad, but still had to give the cop lip over the people like us statement. But that's not the point. I've been clean over 15 years and don't live near town anymore, so I'm pretty sure I would handle things different now, and I know if I hadn't been messed up, then I would have. As far as I know, they never caught the guy. So Mr. Get In Now, let's not meet, 'cause I will let my dog chew your ass.
I use Tinder pretty frequently, and it's usually cool. Just meeting people, chilling, smoking with most of them. So, I match with this guy named Charlie, and he seems cool. He's really cute, and he plays music, which is really appealing to me, as I also sing and play the piano. We talk for a little while, and I agree to meet him at his house. Mistake number 1. Why did I think it was a good idea to meet a stranger in their home? I don't drive, so I take an Uber over, and it's a decent way away, so it's kind of pricey. When he buzzes me into the apartment complex, I got this really creepy vibe, but I shook it off as just nerves. I go up to the 3rd floor, and he's standing at the door. Things are cool, we're just chilling. We smoked a couple of bowls, and we're watching a movie. So, he makes a move on me, and I go with it. We end up on the bed, and we're obviously engaging in adult activities, when out of nowhere, he wraps his hands around my neck. Hard. Now, that's all fine and good with me. I mean, I can dig that in the right setting. But alone in a stranger's house, when he didn't even check to see if it was cool, is not one of those settings. I literally can't breathe, and I'm fairly certain I'm turning blue at this point, and he's just relentless. Not only is he asphyxiating me, he's now yelling in my face. Are you scared? I started to struggle, and he was gripping even harder. I seriously thought I was going to die. By some miracle, I wriggle out of his grasp and start screaming. He's yelling at me to calm down, and I'm frantically trying to put on my clothes. He grabs my wrist as I'm trying to leave, and I use all of my strength to pull away and slam the door. As it was closing, the charming guy bid me adieu with the words, "Fucking cunt." I get home, and I look in the mirror, and I have a bruise on my neck. I tried to cover it with makeup, to no avail. I looked like I was almost strangled to death. Then, he texts me, saying, "I think you need more than one dick." And I'm like, really? You want to bring a friend and kill me together? Anyway, I blocked him and reported him on Tinder. I wish I could have done more, because I seriously think he would have killed me. I've been debating going to the police, but the bruises are gone, and it's a he said she said thing. But I'm really starting to wonder if I should, because the next girl might not be so lucky.
Despite a few creepy instances as a child, there has only been one time in my adult life that I have truly felt primal fear. I live in a village in the middle of the English countryside. To paint an accurate picture of its size, it has a population of 4,000, but feels more like 1,000 due to its spread out nature and being surrounded on all sides by lots of fields, farms, and woods that eventually connects onto a pretty famous forest. It's kinda in the middle of nowhere, and because of this, has notoriously bad phone and internet connections. Having lived here all my life, I know the place like the back of my hand. I know where all the public footpaths through the woods and fields are, where they connect, which are shortcuts, and where to cross deep streams, etc. I've gone on walks in this area throughout my childhood with parents and alone as an adult. Nothing bad had happened. I felt safe here. This story took place last summer in July, after I moved back home from university, had yet to get a job, and smoked a lot of weed. A habit my parents despised, and which I tried to keep hidden from them by going for evening walks, multiple pre-rolled joints hidden away in my hoodie pocket. As usual, this day they both got home at 5 p.m. We had dinner, but chatted for a while longer than usual, as my mom had had quite a hectic day and was telling me about it. Because of this, I ended up heading out for my walk an hour later than routine, around 7 p.m. But as it was summer, the sun was still shining, so honestly, I didn't really notice that it would start getting dark while I was still out. The woodland closest to my house is less than 5 minutes away, and you enter through a gate into a farmer's field. You can see across the open area quite far until the first set of small woods obscures your view. That's where I was heading, as I knew this track takes under 2 hours and leads back onto the same path I was standing on now. More than enough time to smoke the 3 joints in my pocket and for the smell to leave my clothing, I had thought. This entire area is very popular for dog walkers, so it's not unusual to see other people while you are about, and as this is a village, everybody says hello to everybody. I lit my first joint and started walking. I'm just in my own world for a while, until I was less than 100 feet before the entrance to the woods. An elderly man was coming out of them throwing a ball for his collie dog. I finished my joint and stubbed it out. As I got closer, I recognized it was John, who lived on the road next to mine and knew my grandpa. We stopped and said hello as I stroked his dog Max. While talking, I see another man coming out of the woods. No dog, bright green jacket, very tall, and had a good 10 years on me age-wise. Me and John chat another minute and say goodbye. He warns me not to stay out here too long, as it will start getting dark soon. True, the sky was bright pink and orange. The sun was indeed beginning to set. I hadn't really noticed. I continued on down the path towards the man. When we were nearly passing each other, I look up to make brief eye contact, smile, and say hello, like everyone here does, even if you don't recognize the person. My eyes instantly met his. He was already looking at me. His dark eyes locked on mine. He wasn't smiling. I didn't know him at all, but I knew something was wrong. It was in his eyes. I swallowed my politeness and looked at the ground as we passed. I had lived in my uni city the past couple of years, so I knew a red flag when I saw one, and my country bumpkin manners evaporated. I quickened my pace a little, and before entering the woods, slyly looked back. The guy was still walking in the same direction, following John. I felt relieved, laughed, cursed the weed for making me paranoid while lighting up another joint, and started walking into the woods. It takes about 30 minutes to follow the path through the woods to the end. The pathway exited open into another field that led to another set of woods. The sky was now violet, the dimming light having been obscured to me by the trees. I was already smoking my last joint and was near the entrance to the second set of woods when I felt it. Fear. Complete, crippling, absolute fear worked its way like electricity through every layer of flesh. I'd never felt anything like it before or since, but I knew what it was. I whipped around. Standing at the exit of the first set of woods was the man. I could still make out his green jacket in the fading light. He fucking doubled back, and very quickly too. I had looked back several times while in those trees, and he hadn't been there. For a second I froze, as did he. He knew I'd seen. To sprint the distance between us would take him about 5 minutes. He was obviously in good shape. I threw the spliff and fucking bolted into the woods, the only way I could go. I didn't dare look behind me. I sprinted for a couple of minutes before taking a sharp left turn off the path into the trees, hoping to throw him off a bit, but I couldn't see a fucking thing. The light was already darkening, and the trees made it 100 times worse, especially as I was now in the thick of them. Their branches catching on my clothes like fingers, whipping and scratching my bare legs so bad I bled. I ran and ran, my lungs protesting in pain, hating me for smoking so much, while my heart was throwing itself against my ribcage trying to escape. I couldn't anymore. I threw myself on the ground behind a particularly thick trunk, my back against it, knees to my chest, hand thrown over my mouth to stifle my labored breathing, desperately trying to pump air into my lungs for the next sprint. I listened for the first time. A few seconds pass silently. Then I hear him. Heavy footfalls snapping twigs behind me, and about 20 feet to my left. I dare not look in case he sees me. I have my phone, but I know I have little chance of signal being where I was, and knew he'd either hear me talking or see the light from the display. I'm not ashamed to say at this point I start to cry, the tears falling silently down my cheeks. "What the fuck?" I hear a deep voice exclaim. "Where are you? I knew you're here. I saw you." I have to clasp both hands across my mouth to stop my scream escaping. I can hear him moving around. I panic, and I find enough courage to slowly peek from behind the tree. He was about 10 feet behind me, less than 20 feet to the left, with his back to me. I move back, and my eyes search the area around me. I pick up a pretty heavy rock. I carefully check on him again. His back is still turned, but he's searching through the trees, hunched down lower to the ground now. I make a snap decision, and with everything I had left, I threw the rock behind me and to the right. It clattered through the branches of trees and made one hell of a noise. I watched him immediately bolt in its direction, laughing. He fucking laughed. I paused a little, hearing his footsteps get quieter, until I thought I wouldn't be so visible to him if I moved and threw myself forward. I ran, trying to put as much distance between us as possible, but I was also aware that I was getting further and further away from home. I knew there had to be a stream somewhere close. If I found the stream, I can follow it, as it borders the land and ran parallel to some of the footpaths. I ran and ran until the trees finally cleared, and I can just make out another field through them on the other side. I thank God and push myself a little bit further till I'm out of the trees, and the ground disappears from below my feet, and I go head over shoulders down the stream embankment. I crash into the water below, my open mouth and lungs filling with muddy water. As I splutter it out, I feel both relieved to have found the stream and terrified he's heard me. My phone is now ruined. I slowly make my way downstream as quiet as possible, listening out for him the whole time as the stream borders the woods, looking up periodically just in case. After a while, maybe half an hour, I notice the trees begin to thin out and realize this is the edge of the woods where I would have been exiting and where the pathway connected to the original one I'd started on. If I ran, I could get home in less than 20 minutes. As quiet as I could, I dragged myself on my stomach back up on the embankment army style, wanting to stay as low as possible. I peeked over the top. I could just make out the opening of the wood's exit path about 50 feet away. I sat and scanned the forest line for a couple of minutes, my eyes trying to make out movement, despite it being pitch black. Nothing. I couldn't hear anything either. I pushed myself up and sprinted as fast as I could across the field onto the pathway. I knew the gate I entered through was in the adjoining field. It really wasn't far. I was so happy. "You fucking bitch!" came a screech from across the field. I swear my legs nearly gave out then and there. He had been waiting for me. I turned my head and saw him sprinting out of the woods at full pelt. I screamed and pushed myself further, tears coating my face. All I could do was run. I crossed into the main field now, and I could see the moonlight shining off the metal gate. My house was just 5 minutes away after that. I have never focused on anything as much as that gate. He was faster than me and getting closer, screaming at me the whole time about how he was going to slit my throat. I ran and ran, pushing myself up and over the gate and ran up the road. I dared look as I made the turning for my road. He was still fucking following me. I raced up my driveway and threw myself through the door, running into the living room crying and screaming hysterically, pointing behind me towards the door. My dad ran outside while my mom grabbed a hold of me as I collapsed shaking. As it turns out, my parents had already called the police. As I said, I was going out for an hour or so at 7, and it was now past 12 a.m., and I hadn't answered when they had called my now broke phone. Very unlike me. We called the police again to explain. They came and I gave a full statement. Both my parents and the police were horrified. Nothing like this happens here. There hasn't been a reported rape or murder in the last 100 years. But one look at me, and it was obvious I was telling the truth. I was covered head to toe in cuts and bruises, soaking wet and covered in mud and blood. I won't go into how this experience changed me. It's depressing. But I will say that the thing that scares me the most is that they never even had a suspect. Despite him following me so closely, he was gone by the time my dad ran outside. That guy is still out there, and who knows what he is really capable of.
My mum had been a drug addict my entire life. When I was younger, she constantly had people coming and going, and it seemed that a majority of the time, these people were shady. What did I expect? I thought I'd share one experience that still bothers me quite a bit. I was about 12 years old at the time. I was sitting on the couch watching Drake and Josh when there came a knock at the door. My mum wasn't home at the time, so I decided to turn the TV off and remain quiet. "Eloise, you home?" It was a man. I just wanted to drop something off. "Eloise." I stayed quiet. "Eloise, open the damn door. I'm not gonna hurt you." At this point, I was scared. Even as a 12-year-old, when someone says they're not going to hurt you, there's generally something they did in the past that would prompt them to reassure someone of that. Right? He started rattling the door handle. "I swear to God, I will break this door down. You've been ignoring my calls, my texts. You cannot run from me." He began pounding and kicking at the door. I ran to the bathroom, because it was the only door with a lock, and hid in the bathtub with the curtain drawn. I decided to take my bath gun, as I was still young and had not yet outgrown playing with toys during bath time. I put a little water in it and a little shampoo in it. At that point, I heard what sounded like splitting wood, and then footsteps in my living room. I heard him go from room to room, all the while yelling, "Eloise, you can't ignore me now, you bitch." Finally, he came to the bathroom door and tried the handle. "Oh, so you're in there, huh?" More pounding. He kicked the door in and stood still for a few long moments before ripping open the curtain and peering down at me. He had slick black hair with piercing green eyes, a sad attempt at facial hair, black hooded sweatshirt, black jeans, black shoes, and he held a brown bag in one of his tattoo-covered hands. "Oh, even better. I've seen you around here before. You're Eloise's daughter. So sweet." He kept repeating that. "So sweet." It made my skin crawl. He walked over to the window and locked it before squatting next to me. "You're gonna come with me. How about that? I'll buy you some ice cream." I glared at him, trying my best not to look terrified. "Not much of a talker. Your mother could learn something from you." He reached his hand out and rested it on my shoulder. In one quick motion, I pulled my squirt gun from under my leg and began spraying it in his face. He didn't register it at first, but quickly began wiping his eyes. "What the fuck is this? What the fuck? What the fuck?" I hurled my body at him, causing him to fall back and hit his head on the toilet. I grabbed the brown paper bag and ran from the bathroom, out into the hallway and down the stairs. I caught my mum on the entrance steps and pulled her the other direction. "What's going on? You're making me drop my things." She quickly caught on that something was terribly wrong and ran with me to my aunt's house. After catching my breath, I described the man and what he did. She quickly recognized him as a man named Tony, whom she owed a lot of money to. I realized I was still holding the brown paper bag that the man had and gave it to my mum. She found a gun inside. He had showed up to kill my mother.
I live in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in northeast Georgia. It's a beautiful area with hundreds of miles of national forests, some great state parks, and a ton of fantastic camping places. Unfortunately, my hometown is also relatively poor. While there are some out-of-town residents from Atlanta and other places, a lot of people where I live are really poor. I do freelance work as a technical writer, so I can do most of my work online. If I didn't have that going for me, I'd have to move somewhere else. It's just one of those small towns that will rob you of your ability to accomplish anything in life if you stay there too long, without anything else going for you at least. Excluding a handful of doctors and lawyers and Georgia Power Company employees, the only employment in the area is at Walmart, fast food, and a couple of grocery stores. To the east of my town, there's a massive national forest. It's loaded with great camping sites and lots of relatively unused hiking trails. I really enjoy hiking on them with my dog, but it can be a bit of an unnerving experience sometimes. It's about a 10-mile drive from town, and there's no cell phone service or homes for miles. In the past, there have been lots of vehicle break-ins at the trailheads. The gravel parking lots at some of them glitter with bits of broken glass from what I'm guessing were car windows. Sometimes, there are really shifty people hanging around these trailheads or just driving around the Forest Service roads. These are really rough roads, and you'll see these beat-up $500 cars just barreling along roads meant for a 4x4. Some of the people you see in the cars look like the guy that got crushed by an ATM in Breaking Bad. All that being said, it's still a great place to camp. However, you just have to be careful. A few years ago, 2 of my friends and I decided to go play paintball in the National Forest. Probably not legal, I know. We decided to turn the paintball expedition into a camping trip so we could play the next morning too. After a pretty uneventful day of shooting paintballs at each other, we drive a couple of miles to one of the more popular camping spots. Unfortunately, a church group or something had taken up all the spots in the area. This is really the only camping spot that we were familiar with, and it was getting pretty late. We decide to keep on looking, so we drive for about an hour further and further into the woods. By this time, it's getting a bit dark, and we're getting a bit worried about finding a spot. We all had GPS on our smartphones, but none of us had any service. We turn off onto an unfamiliar road that isn't in very good shape. In fact, it looks like the Forest Service Rangers used a backhoe to block off the road with a mound of dirt. A broken metal barrier lay in the woods nearby. That said, it looked like 4x4 vehicles had been going over the mound, so it was pretty worn down. Our F-150 had pretty high clearance, so we decided to go over the mound. There was an old gravel road on the other side, and the road was pretty much clear of debris. We drove a few miles down this road and came across an opening next to a small creek. There were some blue tarps hanging over a plywood table nailed to a tree, which seemed kind of odd. That said, it was pretty much dark at this point, and we didn't want to keep driving around all night looking for a camping spot. We left the truck light running, and we set up the tent. As we were setting up tent, I started to notice that there was a lot of trash in the surrounding woods. I see a green bottle laying on the ground. I take a look at the label, and I see that it's a bottle of Home and Garden insecticide. I was really tired at the time, and I just thought that someone had been dumping their home garbage out here. None of us thought it was weird that someone would be dumping garbage in an area that is more than an hour from the nearest home. We set up camp, had some beers, and made chili from scratch. By this time, it was probably around 11 p.m. As we were eating, we noticed a faint glow from the other side of a nearby hill. At first, we thought it was moonlight filtering its way through the trees. However, the angles didn't make sense. It didn't seem to be a bright light, and it wasn't moving. It was kind of like that glow you'd see over a bright city. We couldn't see the light's off its source, though. Since there was no other access to roads in the area, we decided it wasn't other campers. The hill was about a quarter mile from our campsite, so we decided to go investigate. Under normal circumstances, I know I wouldn't have done so. However, we all had a few rum and cokes in our stomachs, and 2 of us, Jacob and I, decided to take a look. My other friend Isaac decides to stay behind to pop some popcorn over the fire. We start walking towards the light source, and the situation gets even stranger. All the trees in the area have their bark knocked off in a circle around their trunks. We thought it could have been the work of a beaver that lived in the creek, but it seemed strange that the beaver would go around to all these trees and just knock the bark off in a circle. Jacob and I start talking about the ghost beaver in pretty loud voices, probably due to our drunkenness. As we're almost to the top of the hill, Jacob tripped and yelled, "Oh shit!" A few seconds after he yelled, the light, whatever it was, went out. We looked at each other and decided that maybe we don't need to see what that light was after all. We walk back in silence and keep looking back every few seconds. We decide to turn off our flashlight and just use the moonlight to get back to the campsite. When we got a couple of 100 feet from the campsite, I can see my other friend Isaac walking around the campsite. He was wearing a hooded coat that I hadn't seen him wearing before. For some reason, he's carrying his paintball gun around in his hand. It seemed a little odd, we said to each other. The fire had started to die down, so we couldn't see our campsite very well. At this point, we'd probably been gone for almost an hour. From the distance, it looked like Isaac was looking for something. He kept walking around the site and was peering in the tent. When we were almost back to the campsite, we saw Isaac walk up to the road we came in on. We figured that he was going to go use the bathroom and didn't want to wander through the woods like us. When we got back, we sat next to the fire and waited for Isaac to come back. All of a sudden, we see him lurch out of the tent. He stumbles a few feet and vomits. After we left, he had a few more rum and cokes, he mumbles. We ask him why he kept wandering around the campsite with the paintball gun, and he gets a strange look in his face. They're locked up in the cab of the truck. Did you unlock it? We go and check the truck, enter the door code, and see all our paintball equipment just as we left it before. The keys to the truck were still hidden in a magnetic fob underneath. I get a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. Isaac, what were you doing after we left? I ask. I was just watching a movie on my phone, and then I fell asleep, I guess. But you were walking around with your paintball gun, right? Did you just change jackets? Isaac said he had been in the tent since we left, that he had been wearing the same unhooded fleece all night. Someone had been walking around our campsite, and it wasn't Isaac. At this point, all of us are way too drunk to drive, but we decide to go ahead and pack up and go back to my house for the night. We don't bother packing up the tent. We just fold it down with sleeping bags and everything in it. We jump in the F-150, and I start to drive out. When we get to the dirt hump, we see something gray blocking our path. The metal barrier that had been lying in the woods earlier is now back on its stand, right on top of the hump earlier. By this point, all of us had sobered up to the situation. No one wants to get out of the car to try to move the barrier. I had a metal guard in front of the F-150, so I drive forward slowly, tapping the metal barrier with the front of my truck. It falls right off. It must have just been balanced on top, and we drive slowly over it. We were terrified that it would pop one of the truck's tires as we drove over it, but it didn't. As we drive down the road, we see a vehicle following us with its lights off. It's probably about 1,000 feet behind us, but we keep catching glimpses of it as the moon reflects light off it. I start to drive as fast as I can on the Forest Service road, and the other vehicle keeps pace. It doesn't get any closer though. It stays just 1 or 2 turns behind us. We can only see it when the road straightens out. After about 45 minutes of speeding along gravel roads, we make it back to the main paved road. I start to drive everyone back to my house, but I decide to go a different way just to be safe. I didn't get pulled over for a DUI, luckily. Camping can be fun, but very rural camping can be dangerous. I've driven past that metal barrier since that time, but it's always been in place. I would never go down that road again.
For reference, I was a 19-year-old female at the time. Still female, of course, just a little older. I love camping. Anytime my friends and I came home from college, we would load up our cooler and beer, grab some gear, and go screw around outside. Unfortunately, when I was actually at school, none of my sorority sisters or other friends ever wanted to go with me, so I would often suffer withdrawals from camping. One day, the weather was way too nice to waste, so I grabbed some of my gear, hopped in a car I borrowed from a buddy, and drove to a spot that was secluded, yet within a safe distance to civilization, that I could run and get help. Camping also creeps me out sometimes, but that creepy feeling is also somewhat of a pulse for me. It's the same reason that people read these stories. It's fun to be scared. So I make a little camp and get a fire going. I hadn't brought all that much to eat, but I was enjoying myself. Reading and looking around the area, that sort of thing. I got the feeling I was being watched, and I stopped dead in my tracks. I hear a twig crunch over to my right, then see a doe bolt from 100 feet or so in front of me. I laughed at myself and went back to the camp with an armful of wood I had gathered. I kept freaking myself out, hearing sounds just outside of the ring of light casted by the fire. I always get inside my head, so I shrugged it off and kept whittling at the stick I had been messing with. Around 1, I decided to go into my tent and snuff out the lantern. I had been slamming beer in the most unladylike fashion, and smoking cheap cigars. Another reason I like camping. I can't act however I want. So I passed out relatively quick. About 2 a.m., I start hearing footsteps. They sound pretty light, and sort of timid. I think to myself that it's a deer or another animal. More likely a raccoon because I had probably left some food out. I'm still on guard though. About 30 minutes of sleeping with one eye open, I hear a rubbing noise, and the tent fabric is being pushed in a bit. I don't know how I didn't shit my sleeping bag, but I just sat there paralyzed with my bar in my hand. I desperately wanted to thrust the knife through the tent fabric, but I was still holding out hope that it was some of my buddies from the frat joking with me. And then, as sudden as it had begun, it all stopped. I was starting to feel slightly more secure, because daylight would be coming in about 2 or 3 hours, but I sure as shit wasn't going to go to sleep. All of a sudden at about 4 o'clock, I realized I should put my boots on so that if anything did happen, I would be ready. After having stayed up and keeping alert a little while longer, my friend's car alarm goes blaring. I freak the fuck out and run out of the tent. I got about 2 steps before something grabs me around the mouth. I open my mouth to scream, but instead the person's pinky finger slips between my teeth. I have heard that people can perform superhuman feats when they have huge adrenaline rushes. In my case, I just clamped down, and there's no way to say this without sounding ridiculous. His finger popped off. He screamed, pulled his hand away with his missing digit, falling to the ground. He took off running down the hill I was camping on. I took off right quick in the opposite direction. I must have looked ridiculous to people whose house I ran to. A little sorority girl in a wife beater, boxers, and steel-toe boots. I also had some blood that had oozed out of my lip, not from the finger, but because I have also managed to take a pretty big chunk out of my lip as well. I told them what happened. They called the police, got me some real clothing, and the man at the house made me a whiskey and coke. When the cops got there, they checked it out. The cops went to check it out, and when they came back, it was light out. They brought me back so I could get my friend's car, and what I saw just made me more scared. Right next to the tent was a red gas can. He could have just lit me on fire earlier. The finger was also gone, suggesting he had come back. The kicker is they never caught the guy. So somewhere out there is a man sitting down to dinner, maybe alone, maybe with a wife and a couple of kids, and he's missing his right pinky. Background. I work summers as a camp counselor in the northern part of Ontario, Canada. On the date this particular incident occurred, I was camping with a group of 10-year-old boys on the same lake the summer camp was based on. So, like a routine camping trip, we canoed out to the site and set up our tents. Me and my co-counselor, Mike, take turns supervising the kids while they swim, build forts and play games, etc. We cook some food over the fire, sit around and tell stories, cook s'mores, the typical Canadian camping experience. Around 9:30ish, I tell the kids it's time for bed, and they head into their tents, which were positioned a small walk away from the shoreline, but still in line of sight from where we had our fire pit. So the kids have gone to bed, and me and Mike are shooting a shit by the water, smoking a cigarette, just basically hanging out before we decided to head into our tents and call it a night. What happened next still troubles me to this day, and remains my go-to scary campfire story. We were both gazing into the pitch-black night water when we saw a small light approaching us slowly and slightly above water level. We speculated what it could possibly be for a few minutes, before it came close enough for us to see that it was mounted on the front of a kayak and that someone was approaching our campsite. Now, it is important to note that as a camp counselor, part of our training goes over how to deal with stranger encounters in an environment where we are responsible for a group of children on a public property. I was prepared to give the mystery paddler the typical speech about how we are camping with a group from a recognized organization, and we would respectfully ask if they could find another campsite. However, this person's appearance shook me to the bone as the light drew nearer. Paddling this kayak was a woman who looked to be in her 60s. She had incredibly long wisps of gray hair that was trailing in the water. Her skin looked like old leather, and her dead-looking eyes were tough to spot under all her wrinkles. She looked directly at me, and when she spoke, I realized she was missing most of her teeth. "Are all your children safe in bed?" she asked, me pointing in the direction of the tents. Not really knowing how to respond and quite frankly shitting myself, I responded by telling her that they were fine and she had to leave. "That's good, just as expected for this time," she said with a smile, then turned her kayak and paddled off into the night. At this point in time, myself and Mike were legitimately very creeped out, not only by the appearance of this mystery woman, who resembled a freaking corpse, but also her inquiry on the whereabouts and safety of the kids we had brought on the trip. Not knowing what else to do, we grabbed our hunting knives and sat by the fire after checking on the kids. Half an hour later is where shit started to get really creepy. Across the lake, a female counselor was leading another trip for kids the same age group. She sent me a text which read something along the lines of, "Hey, Sean, stop screwing with us. This isn't funny. My kids are really creeped out." I instantly called her and let her know that I just saw someone near my campsite that seemed eerie, and that I was not trying to play a joke. Apparently one of their kids had opened their tent door to take a piss, and seen a woman with long hair standing with her arms open towards them near the shoreline.
In May 2009, I had just broken up with my girlfriend of almost 3 years. We had moved from Calgary to Toronto, and were still stuck living together after the breakup, as we didn't know many people in the city yet. Needless to say, the situation was pretty stressful and upsetting, so when a buddy I was going to school with at the time suggested a weekend camping/fishing trip, I jumped at the chance. He grew up in an area about an hour outside of Toronto called Flamborough. It's really beautiful. Loads of lush forest, farmers' fields, and small rivers and creeks. We decided to camp and fish along a creek called Grindstone Creek. It's close to some wetlands, and the fishing is supposed to be great. We ended up setting up our camp in what was probably a farmer's field. I'm guessing it was trespassing on our part, bordered by a gorgeous forest. We spent the evening fishing, shooting the shit, and drinking some quality craft beers. As it got darker, we made a little fire and roasted potatoes and hot dogs. All in all, it was a really good night. We turned in just after midnight, and we shared a tent. My buddy fell asleep before me, and I stayed up playing on my phone until probably about 1:30. I must have drifted off, because the next thing I remember was being woken up by a high-pitched yipping type noise. I was kind of groggy, and it took me a moment to fully wake up. The yipping was incessant, and it sounded like a weird coyote. I lay there for a moment listening, and then started playing on my phone again, and the noise was annoying as hell. I tried ignoring it, but it sounded like it was getting closer. Finally, it sounded like it had to be no more than 10 feet from the tent. At this point, I was getting a little unsettled. I had seen coyotes in Calgary before, and I thought of them as pretty harmless. They never looked much bigger than a smallish dog. But what if this one was rabid or something? What if it could smell our food? I had a pretty bad anxiety disorder, so I'm prone to worrying about these types of things. I nudged my buddy to see if he was awake, and he was. The noise woke him up too. We discussed what to do about the coyote, and as we hadn't brought anything to scare off critters, not a BB gun, nothing. Finally, he decided he would shine the flashlight on it and holler a lot, hopefully scaring him off. He unzipped the tent, and I watched him pointing the flashlight out into the darkness. I'll never forget what happened next. His legs suddenly went all wobbly, and he sort of stumbled backwards into the tent. He had a really dumbfounded look on his face when he looked at me and babbled, It's not a coyote. It's a dude. It's some weird dude. Normally, I would have thought he was messing with me. I'm a huge wimp and scare easily. I won't even watch horror movies. But I've never seen someone that looked that scared, and I never want to see that expression on someone's face again. So I knew he wasn't pulling my leg. The weird yipping and howling type noises were still going on, and in retrospect, it really didn't sound like a coyote, but I guess in our groggy states it was a way for our brains to make sense of it. Anyways, he kept telling me to just look out the tent flap, to make sure he's not crazy. At this point, I was having a full-blown anxiety attack. My heart was racing. I felt like shit, but I had to look. So I slowly peeked out the flap and waited for my eyes to adjust. And that's when I saw him. He was standing only a few arms' lengths away from the tent. He was swaying a little and wearing a baseball cap. What made it awful, though, what was really creepy, was that he was wearing women's lingerie. That's when I knew there was most likely something very wrong with this guy. If the making high-pitched noises at strangers' tents in the middle of the night didn't give it away. After I pulled my head back inside the tent, my buddy and I discussed what to do. Finally, we decided to yell at the guy to fuck off. My buddy started yelling, "Excuse me, can you fuck off? We're trying to sleep in here." The noise stopped. It was dead silent, and that's when we heard footsteps running towards our tent. They stopped right outside the tent, but we didn't waste any time, and we started yelling again. "Seriously, fuck off! We have a cell phone in here, and if you don't fuck off, we're going to call the cops." With that, we heard him walk by the tent and head off. Sounded like he was moving towards the road. Needless to say, we laid awake, petrified until the first sight of sunlight. Then we hightailed it the hell out of there. We discussed our experience on the way home, and were both pretty embarrassed about how scared we got. It definitely was not manly on either of our parts. And I think because we were both ashamed of how we let some weirdo freak us out so much, we really haven't ever talked about that day since.
I'm a uni student now, but this incident happened when I was in the 8th grade. When I was around 14, I studied a subject focusing on outdoor pursuits for our final assessment. 2 teachers took my class on a one-night camp where we could do activities like rock climbing, kayaking, trail walking, etc. I live in Australia, around an hour from a state forest that was notorious for the backpacker murders. Several bodies have been found, and several more remaining missing. I'm pretty sure all of the murders were linked to the same serial killer. Anyway, in the morning we leave the school and drive out in the bus. When we reach the road that leads to the entrance to the forest, a police car is parked to the side. He spoke to the teacher for a moment, but I didn't hear anything, and no one else seemed to notice or care. Fast forward a few hours, and we're trekked, about 20 of us, to the camping area, somewhere in the middle of the state forest. Some parts are state, some are privately owned, I think. Whilst kayaking that afternoon, we noticed a helicopter doing flybys, but again, my classmates never suspected anything. A couple of mates and I were the first to leave the water, and helped the teacher with some equipment and started building our own rafts. I was standing off to the side when one of the national park guides walked over to one of the instructors and talked in a hushed, slightly stressed out tone. I remember hearing the instructor say stuff like, "You're kidding. I don't believe it." He just looked shocked and taken aback. So at this point, I started connecting the dots, but I didn't say anything to my school friends. Around dusk that night, I got to use the toilet block, which is around 100 meters from the main campsite. As I go in, I remember a guy walking around the other side of the block. I didn't see him very clearly in the diminished light, but he kept glancing around with nervous body language. I couldn't see his face clearly. He wasn't part of our party, and to me, it just didn't fit. I didn't think much of it at the time. Fast forward to the next morning, when we get back to the car park, the teacher tells us that a body was found in the dam, not far from where we were. They didn't want to tell us so as not to frighten us. We later found out it was a young guy who was killed with an axe, and the guy who did it was related to the serial killer who hunted in the same area. I don't know if that guy I saw had anything at all to do with the murders, but it freaked me out a lot afterwards. Haven't been camping since. This happened to my parents back in the late 80s. They were in their mid-20s when this all occurred. My parents decided to go camping in cool California. When they got there, it was kind of late. My mom was sitting down on a log while my dad was unpacking the truck. While sitting down, she heard walking from around the campsite. So she went and quietly told my dad she heard someone walking around. They got the fuck out of there, just in case. They drove about 3 miles down the road with their headlights off so they wouldn't be followed. Once they got there, they set up camp and began to drink their asses off while listening to a boxing match on the radio. Eventually, they settled in for the night. Now, they don't know for sure that this next event is connected to the first, but they believe it is. So they settled in, and my dad was asleep far before my mom. My mom was in the halfway state where they're halfway awake and halfway asleep. Suddenly, she heard the footsteps outside the tent. She abruptly snapped back to consciousness and listened. She tried waking my dad, but he was way too out of it. She listened for what seemed like hours when suddenly she hears, in the creepiest voice you could probably ever imagine, say, "Here I am. I'm going to kill you." While saying this, the man what she believes to be a knife along the tent. She could hear him walking and dragging the knife. She was literally frozen. She couldn't say anything or move. With her mouth agape, she finally snapped out of it and screamed, "Jim! Grab the shotgun! Kill that son of a bitch!" With that, my dad finally awoke. They heard snapping in twigs and footsteps, and heard the guy running away. Of course, my parents didn't have a shotgun. It was a huge bluff that actually worked. My dad got up seconds later and began to run after him, but he was long gone. After that, my parents decided they were going to get the fuck out of there before anything else happened. When they saw their tires were slashed, they were in the middle of nowhere and no way out with a maniac that wanted to kill them. They actually tried blowing up their tires with one of those things you use to blow up rafts. Obviously, that didn't work, but they had to try, right? About an hour or so later, a ranger that was patrolling the area came along to help them out. He brought them back to town so that they can get their tires fixed. While talking to the ranger, they found out that he had been searching for any suspicious activity due to recent murders nearby. My parents were likely the murderer's next victims. I tried finding some of the murder cases online, but was unable to.
My mother recently told me this story. For years I had asked her if she ever tried acid, and she always denied it and got angry when I asked. A few nights ago, she finally broke down and said that she had taken acid a few times, but the last time she did it, she had a bad trip and never did it again. But this is the story she told me. In the summer of 1976, my mom got tickets to go see the Rolling Stones in New York City. She can't remember exactly where in the city. My mom and her 4 friends, they were all about 16 to 18, all got in my mom's car and drove down to the city from Albany, New York, where they lived. It's a good few hours from the city. They got to the show and met up with someone in the parking lot who was selling acid. So they bought some and took it right away. Halfway through the show, my mom started to have a very bad trip, and so did her other 4 friends. She said she had taken acid before, but this was the strongest she had ever taken. They all felt very overwhelmed and decided to leave the venue. They sat in the parking lot in the car. One of my mom's friends was hysterical by now and was getting out of control. My mom decided that she would try and drive back home. A few minutes into the drive, it started to rain really hard, and my mom realized there was no way that she could make it home on that much acid. So she parked the car on the side of the street in the Bronx and locked the doors. Most of the girls were trying to keep the other one under control, so my mom just curled up into a ball in the front seat and was trying to wait it out. An hour goes by, and the acid just seems to grow stronger, when she hears a knock on the window. She looks up to see a man knocking on her window and says, "Please let me in the car. It's raining out here. Let me sit in there till it stops." My mom was really confused and asked, "Are you real?" And she turned to her friends and asked, "Is this guy really here?" All the girls agreed that he was actually there, and they decided to let him in. 1970s was a different time. My mom goes to unlock it, but is having trouble. It's dark, and she's on a head full of acid. The guy starts to pound very heavily on the window now, shouting, "Let me in, you fucking whores!" My mom is still trying to open the car door, but just can't do it, and starts to cry. She looks up at the man, and the thought crossed her mind, "That's an ugly fat fucker." She says, I can't open the door." And the guy looks behind him and darts away. Another car was coming in their direction. My mom and her friends stayed in the car that night when it finally wore off, and they drove home the next morning. About a year later, my mother was working in a restaurant as a waitress, and a news break comes over the television. She had heard about the recent serial killer on the loose in New York City that has been going on since the summer before. When she looked at the TV, there was Son of Sam, David Berkowitz, a well-known serial killer, and the same man who was trying to get into my mother's car that night. At first, I didn't really believe my mom. Shit sounds so fake, and so I did some research. Here are some facts that do back up my mom's story. David Berkowitz was on a killing spree during July of 1976, the summer of the concert, to April 1977. He mostly attacked young women sitting in cars. He preferred his victims to have long, dark, wavy hair, which my mother and her 2 other friends had. In the summer of July, August, and September of 1976, David mostly killed in Queens and Bronx. He seemed to really dislike women, which makes sense of calling my mother a whore for no reason. I wonder why he didn't just shoot through the window, but my guess was since there was 5 girls, he may not have realized that at first, since 4 of them were crouched in the back, he wouldn't be able to kill all of them. So if my mom hadn't been having a bad trip on acid, she would have opened that door and, well, I don't want to think about that. Thank God for acid. I didn't accidentally stumble into LSD. I have done mushrooms about 5 to 6 times, the last being a year ago, and never experienced anything that resembled a bad trip. I have also read countless articles about LSD. I'm the type of person that likes to know exactly what to expect when taking any drugs. I knew exactly what to do to have a good trip and how to stop a bad trip once you feel it coming on. But sometimes, reading and learning cannot prepare you for what is to come. I'm not going to describe to you every detail of the trip because, to be completely honest with you, I'm not ready to even think about certain aspects of this trip. It literally scares me to the deepest parts of my soul. It happened last Friday night. I had been at a friend's house drinking. Mistake number 1. I would advise anyone thinking about doing LSD or even shrooms to not drink beforehand. It was a cold and rainy night. Mistake number 2. I would say that cold weather has a definite impact on a trip. I wouldn't necessarily say that you need to do it on a warm and sunny day, but those are the ideal conditions. We were going to head to a house party of another friend's, and right before leaving, my friend told me that he had a few hits of acid and asked me if I wanted to try some. I said sure. Mistake number 3 and 4. Do not suddenly do LSD. Try and plan your day around it and know far in advance that you are going to be taking a trip. Also, I cannot tell you how important this one is. Do not take LSD or shrooms when you are going into a public setting with dozens of strangers. For the love of God, don't do it. This is what threw me into madness. Stay with close friends in a comfortable and familiar environment, and have no more than 3 or 4 other friends. The only reason I survived this night was because my overall mood was happy. Now, do not take shrooms or LSD if you're feeling sad or depressed. I can't fully remember the first 45 minutes of my journey because, like I said earlier, I was a little drunk. And then mistake number 5 happened. When I started realizing that the trip was about to start, I got really excited and kept telling my mind where I wanted it to go. I would advise against doing this. Just be relaxed, calm, and in a general happy mood. Don't try and tell your mind where to go. Just let it go. It took another 25 minutes of me just sitting there and waiting for the trip to start. I've read so many articles about the colors and imagery you see, but I kept focusing on objects that I thought would start to deform, but nothing did. Mistake number 6. You are not God. The trip will start sooner or later. Don't get sad that you aren't feeling any effects. For some people it takes 30 minutes to start. For others, it can take upwards of 2 hours. I knew this before I took the LSD, but for some fucking reason I didn't listen to the previous warning I had learned about. I started getting more depressed and thinking that I was different and that I wouldn't get to see anything out of the ordinary. Boy, was I fucking wrong. The next half an hour was about the same, and then it started. At first, it was beautiful. I was sitting in a room with two of my friends, and they were talking about just random things, but every word they spoke felt like it came right out of their mouth like a wave and absorbed into my body. I could feel their conversation. I took out my phone and started looking at my pictures. I spent a good 5 minutes, at least I think, but I can't be sure. At this point I was starting to lose my grasp on time, looking at each picture and observing the faces of my friends. The faces would change colors and start morphing. It felt like the faces were morphing into the representation of the person's soul. I don't really know how to describe it, but at the time I felt a complete and utter connection with each picture. People started coming into the room we were in, and I know for a fact that this was what completely turned what was previously a really great trip into the worst 6 hours of my entire life. I couldn't stand seeing new faces. My mind was telling me that these strangers knew nothing about me, and that no matter what I would say to them, they would never care. My friend, who was my babysitter or guide, saw that I was no longer smiling and took me out of the room and into the backyard right away. He told me to calm down and remember that I was tripping and that anything negative that was entering my mind wasn't reality. This gave me a sense of relief for about 10 seconds. All of a sudden, I was completely disconnected from my friend. My mind started telling me that there was no connection between him and I, and that no matter what he says, it's all lies. I started thinking about how I came into this world alone, and there was no way that I would ever connect with anything, and one day I would leave the world all alone. Imagine having the strongest feeling of despair you have ever experienced. Multiply that by 10, and you might understand what I felt at this moment. I told my friend that I'm completely cool and walked off. These were the first words I had said in over an hour, and the last words I spoke for the next 6. I went into the house and decided to go into the bathroom and wash my face and try to regain reality. The bathroom was small, and this made my trip about 5 times worse immediately. I felt like I was trapped in this room, and that this was hell. This was where I would spend the rest of eternity. I tried opening the door, but I couldn't open the handle. I couldn't even reach for the handle. Every time I reached for it, it kept getting further and further away, like it was avoiding me in an endless hallway. I have no idea how long I was in that bathroom, but it felt like a week. I'm not ready to talk about the next 3 hours of my night. At some point, my friend and babysitter took me to his house and left me there. I asked him the next day why he did this, and he told me that I looked extremely sleepy, and that when he put me down into his bed, that I closed my eyes. He said that he made food and was inside his house for another 15 minutes, and when he came back to the room to check on me, my eyes were still closed, so he assumed I was still sleeping. I wasn't sleeping. At this point, it was too hard for me to try and describe to you what happened in those 3 hours. This is because I'm not ready to even think about it. But know that I remember everything from those 3 hours, and they were the worst 3 hours of my life. Fast forward through those 3 hours, and we introduce Miriam. I don't know why I named this figment of my imagination Miriam, but I do know that its name is definitely Miriam. Miriam is not a man, and is not a woman. It's almost impossible for me to describe to you what Miriam is, but I'll do my best. Miriam is everything, and Miriam is nothing. It constantly talked to me, but it never spoke any words. Rather, whenever Miriam portrayed a thought, I just knew what it was. Miriam didn't have a face, nor body, nor even anything that I can describe to you. But whenever Miriam appeared, I just knew it was Miriam. Miriam told me to go outside and lay down in the grass. When I did this, there were thousands of little hands that grabbed me and tried to take me into the ground, into Miriam's world. I got up and went inside and sat down in a chair. But then the world around me collapsed. Imagine a picture of purgatory. There was nothing, just whiteness, and it engulfed everything. Miriam told me that the only way to come back into my world was to go outside and lay down in the grass again. And so I did. The same hands appeared. This went on back and forth for what I estimate as 2 hours. Then, the single happiest moment of my life occurred. Miriam told me that it was time to go home. For the first time in 8+ hours, I felt like there was a real world and that I could go back to it. I found a piece of paper and wrote the following words. "You are going to be okay. You're just tripping, but it will soon be over and the world will return." I reread this piece of paper for about half an hour until some normality started returning to me. The next 2 hours were normal, but extremely scary. I was trying as hard as possible to remain in the real world and not return to the hell that I had just went to. It took all my brain power and mental thinking for this to happen. My friend came to me, drove me home, and I went to sleep. I haven't once thought of this experience in the 12 days preceding it, until last night. I went to sleep last night, and Miriam returned. Miriam was in every single dream of mine, and always trying to tell me something. I thank whatever God there may be that none of these dreams were lucid dreams, so I don't really remember anything Miriam said. And there you have it. My descent into hell. I don't know if I will ever try LSD again, but I know that everything I did that night led me to my bad trip. The highs of it were absolutely beautiful. I felt feelings and colors and vibrations that I had never felt in my life. For any of you that are thinking about taking this drug, please heed my warnings. LSD is quite possibly the strongest thing in the entire world, and it can make you go completely insane if not done right. It should be respected for the sheer power it can have. There is no reason for any of you to make any of the mistakes I did. Maybe one day in the far future I will try it again, and hopefully it will be a beautiful experience. But for now, I'll stick to my weed. I'd been planning to take some L at this punk show in Austin, Texas. I've tripped acid around 50+ times since, but I cry even thinking about this trip in particular. It was the one time the mighty me, somebody who never loses control, would go completely nuts and nearly suffer dire consequences. We stopped by my house at a meeting spot so we could begin following the others to the show. I was in the car with my friends Jordan and Andrew. In the other car would be some characters known to me as Aaron, Robert, and Shane. Nobody else knew I dropped acid at the show. I ate 2 slices of the gel. It would take effect way faster than it ever had before. I felt like I had taken something almost as soon as the shit landed on my tongue, but it really took hold within 25 to 30 minutes. Placebo or not, I knew I had a chemical in my body and it was about to do its work. We had a 1-hour drive from X to Y, so I knew I'd be kicking by the time of the arrival. It would be at this time all words would become meaningless and not worth saying because words couldn't put together anything I was feeling or doing, but I knew exactly what I was doing. I was sitting in the back of the car, and everything was coming to life before my very eyes. I began to see 3-dimensional flowers pulsating from the back seat, and they were getting very playful with each other. And the more happy I felt about them, the more sensitive and swooshy they would get. I felt put on the spot. I had to look at myself in the mirror just to reassure myself that I am still there. I was becoming an amorphous blob, a good old puddle of fuckness it was in my mind. I could tell I was coming up harder than I ever had in my life, and I was unprepared. I was also sweating bullets. It brought a very weird sensation I have never felt again. My skin melting. I literally felt my skin just melting downwards with the sweat. I almost fooled myself into thinking, yes, I am actually fucking melting right now. But good thing I still had about an ounce of willpower left to control my senses. Fear starts kicking in hard, and regrets of taking the drug. But why? I repented in my mind, praying for us to get to this damn show faster, so I can just get it over with. I remember this being a very important thing to me, even though the thought of being there scared me to death. I already knew I was going to have a really bad trip, but I didn't want to spoil anybody's fun and have them turn around and drive me fucking home. It was actually taking every ounce of my physical and mental strength to even sit in the back seat of the car. But I was so lost within myself, I thought that I was painstakingly dragging this car to the show all by myself. Funny thing is, nobody else gave a shit. Nobody knew the importance of the show or how this would be the one thing that turns me into a nicotine stain on the fabric of society. Once we got to the venue, my doors swung wide open, and a bunch of really hairy people that looked like wolfmen. They grabbed me and pulled me out of the car. I looked up and saw this group of strange people, and they were saying things like, "Damn, how much did you take? Bad trip. How was the weather over there?" I couldn't tell one person from the next. For instance, I look at Shane, but he is wearing my friend Kingsley's face, and he isn't even at the show. I thought I knew who I was looking at, but the faces all look the same, dark and really fuzzy, some very reptilian and sculpted. I would go with the flow of this feeling and leave my body for periods of time where perception would totally go haywire. Everything around me was washing into an ancient and evil machine that was riddled with blood and flesh. This great construct's gears crushed the bones of the living to dust, serrated steel teeth that had clenched thousands of people within. The strongest of men would be at the front row of teeth to represent the power of the machine, and to let it be known none would be able to conquer, nor even understand it. It was a rusty piece of work, with no rhyme or reason other than bending people to its will and killing them if they would resist. I found myself inside the venue. I could feel a lake of sweat pouring down my entire body. I'm walking around holding my ticket out in front of me like a moron. Walking felt like I was walking on water, if you can imagine what that feels like. Safety first. I see a large pole in the middle of the place and decide to wrap my entire body around it like a snake to keep balance. The music was knocking me off my feet and I needed support. Ravenous black and blue outlined cats ran across the floor. They were very agitated and wet pussies. I had to really watch my step at this point. The mosh pit turned into a whirling vortex of fists, knives, and assault weapons. People ran by me and would throw themselves violently into the vortex, some grabbing me, trying to take me with them. The crowd was not human anymore. I didn't even know why I was there. I was now in hell. The people were just not normal to me. They had become very mutated and vampiric. The world seemed very alien, and they all stormed and stomped in a great circle, laughing and chanting my name, while I'm in the middle wrapped around this pole for dear life. They began pulling out AK-47s, machetes, and RPGs, and fired all their guns and missiles into the ceiling for a while, before the devil himself stepped onto the stage very casually and began to speak. He screamed in a very high-pitched voice.
How the fuck you guys doing? We are Holy fucking Grail.
A very loud note was hit after this, and I saw two sexy women, legs spread wide open to a fiery fucking explosion, of course, that rose from the stage, thus revealing the most epic show I had ever seen in my life. The frontman, Satan, was growing to a gargantuan size as the song began, and for the moment it seemed like it was just me and him. He pointed at my face like something out of a 3D movie and nodded at me. His hair flickered all around and curled into snakes at the ends that hissed at me. He was most definitely welcoming me to my new, chaotic home. All the gutter punks began to have a giant orgy at this point, covered in blood. A lot of them were touching me and trying to assassinate my sense of character and humiliate me sexually. All words and sounds were inaudible other than it sounding a lot like Dragon Force. I let go of the pole and hit my face on the floor. I was crawling around this sticky, bottomless pit when suddenly I was helped up by some brave soldier who had enough time to dodge all the explosions, homosexual demons, and ravenous cats. I was slammed against the wall before I turned around, feeling my way around it until I found a staircase that led far into the ceiling. I sat on the very bottom step and was almost forced into staring at the ground, trying to ignore the intense visuals. I kept hallucinating that I was looking off the balcony of the building itself, but I saw myself falling from it fast to my death, over and over and over and over again, until it completely spiraled out of control, throwing my vision into a never-ending kaleidoscope of Nazi Germany and all its very important people. I would look over to the door that led to the balcony, and I started to tear up and eventually cried. I felt I was going to be thrown off the balcony by force at any moment, and nothing could help me. And right when my fear hits its breaking point, I see the whole entire building just fucking collapse with everybody in it. And over and over and over again, this cruel but perfect visualization would repeat itself until I couldn't possibly be any more scared. It was as if my fear itself just broke, snapped in half, and the image of my shattered soul and mind had been burned into my eyes. I saw Jordan in front of me now, and all around him, all I can see is an infinite pattern of stairs cascading violently in and out of each other, with him stuck in the center, trying to get my attention with facial expressions. Jordan says when he actually looked over at me, he said my hand was in an L shape around my mustache, pointed over towards some people standing at the bar. He said I took a really deep breath and began shouting, "Watch out! The fucking stairs!" He also says any time he saw me at the show, I would be paralyzed, taking enormous breaths, and I would smile at the ground every few seconds. But then I'd go back into a very serious, jaw-dropping and petrified stare. He reports he was worried about my mental state at this time. Now, the worst feeling of all was feeling completely abandoned. I knew that my friends were going to leave without me at this point, and be laughing their asses off about it on the way home, yucking it up and saying shit like, "Yeah, we sure showed that guy," leaving him back there tripping and shit. I just sat back and accepted it like nothing though. I figured I had already accepted I was dead by this point, and my very soul fabric would be stained for the rest of my life. No matter what I did, no matter where I sat or stood, or what I thought I could think, everything was a life or death decision at this point. This was do or die. Everything was absolutely hazardous to my health and well-being. I couldn't shake the feeling of being left here to die. I had to put all my trust into my friends, and for them to just drive me to hell and leave me there just wasn't them. Now I would finally see the light. Through all this madness and chaos, this was not who I expected to see in hell. I saw Jesus Christ standing in a window. He was smiling and waving for my attention. I ran to him as fast as I could, and I stood before him for a while, staring straight into his face, gasping for breath, sweat pouring down my face. I was stunned. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, and I was so happy that if anyone could help me in this situation, it would be Jesus. He kept speaking, but it sounded like he just inhaled a shitload of helium, so I couldn't understand. I grabbed him by the shoulders and I yelled, "Thank God you're here." His lips moved again, but I couldn't understand. I sat and smiled crazily at him, still holding his shoulders. Then I kept yelling, "What?" at him, getting closer and closer to his face each time because I couldn't fucking hear what Jesus had to say, and I was getting pissed. So at some point, one of my friends directs me outside and is leading me away. Apparently Jesus was trying to sell me something cool and shiny. I was led outside to the car until we were eventually driving home, just me and Jordan. I asked him 1,000 times if he knew where we were and if they were going to leave me. He reminded me I was perfectly fine and that they weren't going anywhere without me. But I had to reassure myself every 2 minutes this wasn't happening. After being in the car for a timeless amount of time, I began to feel way better, and the ego death began to cease, and I was feeling what I normally felt when I took acid and was happy to embrace the creamy tenderness. I realized also this whole scene took place within a 3-hour period, and I still had many to go. I got home, and my dad was waiting for me at the door because he had some new fishing poles for me and my bro. He was flying in the next morning and I forgot all about it. Trying to avoid my dad, I tell him the fishing poles are fucking beautiful, and then run to my room and I plopped on my couch, lit a bowl, and sighed. I fucking made it, I cheered. I was dissociated the rest of the night, going over what just happened to me and being amazed how fast a trip can switch gears. I listened to Jimi Hendrix's blues album and had an orgasm. I also watched some old Black Sabbath videos on VHS and kept going into that lopsided world of wackiness. Dimensions on objects really took amazing and bendy forms. I could see patterns on everything I looked at, and they crawled all over everything I could see. Electricity was shooting out of me in all directions and wrapping around various objects, creating enormous grids outlined with equations and the very fundamentals of geometry. My room seemed to be made of sand, and small pyramids were forming across my tile floor. My forehead was darting up and outwards from my skull in the mirror, creating a crazy red bird mohawk on my head. I could see the molecules floating through the air and see every slight detail and more. The color was really bright and high contrast appearing, but sometimes it would get dim and serious on me. The room was alive and clever. It wanted to wash me away, and I naturally fought it off, feeling weak. I kept having momentary flashbacks, shattered fragments of the show I was just at that blew my fucking balls off. I kept hearing the guitar screaming solos while my body convulsed, and I would see myself from bird's eye view sitting on the stairs. Then I'd go even higher, and I'd be looking down at the venue from the sky, but I couldn't stop it. I soared even higher. Then the next thing I knew, I was seeing the entire world from space. Everybody I ever tripped with to that point was standing around the Earth in a circle, and we were oscillating. They even showed the characteristics they usually showed whilst tripping. Somehow I just knew that they were all here in some fucked up way. I could feel a wobbling feeling, and the visuals went from side to side like I was on a boat for a moment, before I was just looking down at myself from a bird's eye view again. I was still at the show, in my mind's eye. Number 1. I was messaged by a girl on Plenty of Fish. Let's call her Ashley. It was one of those conversations that immediately took off, and we were talking for at least 4 hours straight. We decided to go get dinner. She was even better in person. Beautiful, witty, laughed at all my stupid jokes and the whole bit. We exchanged goodbyes, and that was the end of our evening. We were texting until about midnight when she says, "You're going to hate me. We should just be friends." So I'm like, okay, whatever. She calls me the next day and apologizes, so I give her a second chance. At the end of this date, we start making out like we were in middle school, and she stops us before we get too far and says she's not ready for that yet. Okay, cool. I can respect that. So I get home, and she texts me saying that I was just going to use her had we had sex, and calling me a pig. Okay. So the next day, I get a text from Ashley's phone asking if I knew where she was, and I was the last person to talk to her. Her friend went to her house, where Ashley had apparently left her phone in her car, and the front door was wide open. So I told this mystery person to call the cops. When she refused, I said that I would, and lo and behold, Ashley shows up. I had just gone for a walk. Didn't know you cared about me so much, lol. Yeah, okay, I'm done with this situation. The next day I go to work. I usually leave my phone in my truck until lunch. So when I went out for lunch at noon, I had 115 new texts and 48 missed calls. Yep, that's it. I'm done. So I block her number, and that's it. Wrong again. She knew where I worked and a rough estimate of the time I got off work, which was almost an hour and a half from where she lived. She tried following me home. I could see her car, and I took a roundabout way of getting home and even ran a few red lights, but managed to lose her. It's been almost a year, and I haven't heard from her since. Number 2. So this was from OkCupid. Now, I'm a chick of the larger variety, and I always post a current body shot because I don't like when people waste my time if they're not going to be into me. I never got why people post misleading photos, like people aren't going to notice when you meet. So I was talking to this guy. He seemed nice enough, and he asked me to buy me dinner. Okay, sure. He had only posted a face shot. When we met in person, he was easily clearing over 450 pounds. Not really into that, but I stuck it out because he seemed like a nice person. We get coffee first, and then walked over to the restaurant. Now, I'm no athlete, but I do like to hike and rough it in the woods from time to time camping. I may not be winning any marathons, but I can walk for miles. This poor dude was wheezing within 20 feet of walking. Clearly it was an effort for him. I felt bad for the guy, and I try to be open-minded, but I can't date someone that unhealthy. We get to the restaurant, which was really good, and he tells me about himself and his life. He told me about his roommate, who was dating a crackhead. They would fuck all over the place with the doors open, do all kinds of hard drugs, and were just slovenly dicks. He also told me he was a dom, in the BDSM sort of variety, and started to imply we could go make out later and he would top me. I said I had to leave after dinner and scooted as soon as it was polite to do so. 6 to 7 months later, I try my luck again, this time with a photographer. We got along okay, conversation went well, and in the course of the date he asked me about bad dates I've been on. I brought up the larger guy from before and mentioned the wheezing and the pushing to top me. He asked if the guy's name was so-and-so. Turns out, I was on a date with the guy's roommate. I don't use dating sites anymore. Number 3. I went along with a friend on her first date with this guy she met on OkCupid. She was nervous about meeting him alone, so he told her to bring a friend and he'd bring one of his friends. She tells the guy I'm not single. He says that doesn't matter. His friend is cool with it and just likes to meet new people. I also like to meet new people and I'm willing to help her out, so I agree. Fast forward to the bar. Guy shows up and he's gotta be as old as my dad, which, whatever, she likes older guys. He still seemed kind of too old for her, but it's none of my business. He also came alone. Perhaps he figured he'd scored 2 women at once this way. He sits down, and everything immediately goes to hell. Guy keeps telling us about how gorgeous I am, while trying to touch my friend, trying to get her to hug him, putting his hand on her knee, telling her to smile, stuff like that. Just being really obnoxious. She finally tells him he needs to stop touching her. He tells her to relax and keeps winking at us. Tells me I need to control her, telling us we're so gorgeous and so beautiful over and over again, as though he'd hit the magic number of compliments and we just rip our clothes off right then and there. Friend and I are giving each other the serious eyebrows. So I try to engage him. Tell me about yourself. What's your job? I make a lot of money. Wink. What do you like to do in your free time, etc.? He just keeps giving us stupid, vague answers like he's being coy, and just keeps repeating how pretty we are. Seeing that we're not going for it, he starts telling us, somewhat irritably, that we're just on scholarship. I ask him what that means, and he just winks again. This fucking guy. So I say, let me tell you what I think that means. I think that you're upset that we're not excited that a man of your age and means is spending time trying to woo us, and that we're only behaving this way because we're young and attractive. Is that what you're trying to say? He says no. I start to ask him again what on scholarship means, and he interrupts me, holds up his finger and says, "You're gorgeous, but you really need to stop talking." Date over. Friend and I are agape. He fucking winks again, like he didn't just tell me to shut my mouth. Friend says, "Okay, we're done here. Good night." We stand up and go to another table in the same bar. He doesn't follow, though he does come by later to apologize. Apology not accepted. Saw him around the bar later trying to foist his charms on other young women hanging about and having just about as much luck. What a douche. Number 4. Around March of 2014, I started talking to this girl on Tinder. She seemed cool and fun, and after about a week of talking, she suggested we meet up in person. She invited me to this coffee shop, and I accepted. However, the day of, she started messaging me saying she had to tell me something. Her pictures on Tinder weren't actually of her, and yes, she was a guy. He claimed he really liked talking to me though, and begged me to still meet up with him. And naturally, I declined. I blocked his profile and continued on with my life. About a week later, I started talking to another girl. Once again, she seemed cool and fun and we hit it off. She asked me if I spoke to people on Tinder frequently, and rather stupidly, I told her about my previous encounter with the man lady. She asked me if I wanted to meet up, and I said sure, as long as it was in a public place. We decided on a cafe, and the next day I sat at the table, waiting. 5, 10, 15 minutes had passed, and she was nowhere to be found. I then peered out the window and saw, from across the street, a man staring at me intently. I looked away, waited a few seconds, and looked back. He was still standing there. At that point, I left the cafe, got on my bike, and booked it home. I was definitely a little freaked out, but tried to pull myself together and reason that no one could have followed me. I then deleted my Tinder profile, and things were normal for a few weeks. About 3 weeks later, I started getting phone calls. The numbers all showed up as unknown. I picked up the first few times to some guy breathing heavily into the phone. I was already a little freaked out. After about a day, I stopped picking up any call unless it displayed the caller's name. I then started receiving text. At first, they were pretty harmless, calls for attention and begging me to meet in person. It then changed to very sexual texts, until eventually the messages became threatening, and whoever was messaging me started throwing out my family and friends' names and whereabouts, saying she would get them involved unless I answered. Because they were texting me, I could see a displayed number. But when I called phone providers, they told me the number couldn't be traced and that it was probably a track phone. Great. I waited about 2 weeks, not responding to the texts, thinking I shouldn't feed the troll. But eventually it became too much. I started getting upwards of 50 texts and phone calls a day. I would wake up to 10 to 20 texts every morning. I then decided to change my number altogether. The texting and calls stopped for a while, but sure enough, it started happening again. I called my phone provider asking if they ever gave out numbers at a user's request, and they said their policies stated that they wouldn't and couldn't unless valid identification was provided. Then one day, I tried logging into my Facebook, but was denied. Within a day, friends started contacting me asking what the hell I was doing, saying that they were getting terrible messages from my account. In particular, one of my girlfriends was receiving messages about her mom who died years ago. I apologized profusely and told people what was going on. I contacted Facebook and explained the situation, and they helped me access my account again, at which point I deactivated it for a while. Enough was enough. I decided to contact the FBI, explaining what had been going on for over a month now. They documented everything, but told me since I, or any of my relatives and friends, were in no immediate danger, they probably wouldn't be able to do anything. At that point, I felt stuck. I thought about hiring a private investigator or a hacker. I decided against it, however, and just hope it would fade out if I never answered. I left my Facebook deactivated and ignored any texts or phone calls. I never had any trouble at home, but some of my closest friends received the occasional texts as well, which weirded us all out. I hated that they got dragged into it. One day I came home and things felt very eerie. Doors unlocked, windows open, and no one home. A strong breeze running through the apartment. I did a check of the place and found nothing else weird, so I locked everything up and just waited for my roommates to get home. It's been almost 7 months now. The calls and texts have more or less stopped. I'll get an occasional text, but at most once every 2 weeks. At the peak of it, I was receiving almost 100 texts a day. It definitely affected my social and personal life. I became much more wary of the people around me and my surroundings. I just felt like I couldn't really focus on anything until this stopped. Work was difficult, though I tried to maintain my composure as best I could. Everything was just weird. Life was weird. I've since stopped using all forms of dating apps and websites. Things are getting back to normal at this point, and I just want to put it all behind me. I'm moving at the end of this year, so it'll be nice to have a fresh start in a new place. I'm not going to sit here and say all dating apps are dangerous and no one should use them, but definitely cover your bases. Ask more questions before meeting someone. FaceTime them first, Skype, anything. I was naive about it, and I regret it. Be safe, stick close to your friends, and try meeting people in more traditional ways. I was out camping with my mom and then 6-year-old brother when a white pickup truck rolls up into our campsite. 3 or 4 guys get out of the truck, all wearing small bright white lights attached to their hats that blind us from seeing their faces much. They approach my mom and start asking her questions about who we are and what our plans are for the night. My little brother stared, whimpering, and stopped eating the Doritos he'd been happily munching on, and I got the impression that my mom was creeped out as well. So the men leave after about 5 minutes and told my mom that they were official campground employees who were just making sure everyone was doing all right. Their truck certainly didn't look official, and they weren't wearing anything that would suggest that they were more than just regular, albeit creepy, dudes wandering around and being nosy. My mom told my brother and I to get in the car and take only a few essentials, like clothes and a bit of food, and we went to my grandmother's house and spent the night there instead. We left the tent at the campsite, giving the illusion that we were still there. The next morning, after we told my grandmother about what had happened and that we were suspicious, we went back to the campsite to gather our things and head home. When we pulled up, we immediately noticed that our stuff had been picked through by someone who wasn't us. There were footprints leading up to our tent, and the zipper was stuck halfway open like someone was trying to close it. It was closed when we left, and they didn't succeed. Our sleeping bags also had boot prints on them. We never saw those guys again, but we still wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed.
Last week, my wife asked me if we could go camping. She loves nature, me, not so much. Nonetheless, I said we could go to make her happy. She is excited as hell, so we pack up all our stuff and head out the very next day. We wake up pretty early and drive out to a small secluded place of land that my parents own. We make camp there and spend a couple of hours setting up the tent and the campsite. By this time it's the middle of the day, so we get ready and go hiking. It's beautiful up there. No cell phones, no people, no worries. It's the fucking bugs that get to me. I can't stand those damn things. After a while of hiking, it starts to drizzle, so we decide to head back. We get back to the campsite just as it's getting dark. We make a fire, eat, roast marshmallows, and tell scary stories. It was a great time, but eventually my wife starts getting a little tired, so we decide to go to sleep. We get in our tent, and I roll out our double sleeping bag and we both get in together. After a while of lying there, my wife starts to shiver. "Are you all right?" I ask. "I'm fine," she says. She keeps shivering and eventually tells me she isn't feeling very well, but doesn't want to ruin our trip. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I was psyched that she said that, because I wanted to get the hell out of there. As I said before, I'm not a big fan of nature. I feel her forehead and she's burning up. I tell her that she may have a fever and that we should probably go home. She looks bummed, but eventually gives in and I get her up and take her to the car. She sits in the car while I pack up our things. In the middle of taking the tent down, I hear her honk the horn a couple of times. I run over to the car and I ask her what's the matter. "I saw someone in the trees above the campsite. I wasn't sure if it was a person, but as soon as I saw them move, I was sure it was someone, so I honked the horn," she says to me, looking pale and panicked. I can tell she is upset, but I don't really believe her. So I just tell her to relax and that I'm almost done packing. I go over to the campsite and start gathering our things outside the tent. I step back into the tent to roll up the sleeping bag, and suddenly I hear my wife yelling my name. It sounds like it came from the woods. What the fuck is she doing out there, I say to myself. "Help, Jack. My leg is bleeding." I rush out of the tent and look toward where I heard the scream. I glance over to the car and see she is asleep in the passenger seat. A huge wave of fear passes over me. I'm standing there, paralyzed, and then I hear the voice in the woods again. This time, it's behind me. "Help me, Jack. Please." It sounds like my wife, but somewhat off, too raspy and deep. At this point, I'm fucking terrified, and I just want to get the hell out of there. I quickly grab most of our things and shove them in the car. I left the tent, but I didn't even care. I got in the car and sped away from that place as fast as I could. When we finally got home, I asked my wife to tell me exactly what she saw when she was in the car. She said it was pale, and she thought it was a naked person crawling behind some trees. She saw them stand up against a tree, and that's when she honked the horn, and they dropped down and crawled away. This is why I hate nature.
to start this by saying this is taking a lot for me to finally talk about. I've kept it a secret from my family, and from my friends who were a part of it, we never talked about what happened after that day. But I want to give you a backstory before I drive into details. I've never been much for the city, so living in the suburbs outside of one of the largest cities in Pennsylvania is not my ideal place to live. It's a small town with only a few thousand people living in it, but only a 5-minute drive to the middle of downtown. My friends and I, country boys at heart, frequently would have fires or go fishing, and even go out on camping trips when we had the chance. My 2 best friends and I all played football together and have grown up attached to each other at the hip. We did everything together, so leaving for college was a scary thought, and the not-so-distant future as well. For our last summer together, after our senior year, we decided to go on one last camping trip before we went our separate ways. My 2 best friends, Kevin and Buddha, his real name is Kyle, but only his parents call him that, wanted to go somewhere that we had never gone camping before. We all agreed to go down to Allegheny National Forest for a weekend of fishing, drinking, and reminiscing. I know, underage drinking, but we were young and dumb, so on Thursday we packed up all of our supplies, fishing poles, bait, beer, and food, and left early Friday morning. The trip took a little over 4 hours, with frequent stops at rest stops to get snacks and drinks because of our lack of planning for the drive. Our parents made sure that we all had our cell phones in case something happened and we needed to call them. Of course, I didn't understand the point of that. If anything happened, they were 4 hours away, but naturally we took them just to make them happy. When we got to the camping area, we kept driving. Being the daredevils that we were, we wanted to be far away from anyone else to give it a real camping feel. We found a beautiful spot right on the edge of the lake, which we all agreed would be a perfect spot to pitch our tent. Because we love the fish, the first thing we did after we got our fire pit and tent ready was take our canoe straight for the lake. It was a beautiful day for fishing. The sun was shining without a cloud in the sky. I even caught a few bass for dinner. So that night we ate up the fish, drank half a case of beer, and told scary stories to freak each other out around the campfire. But something in the back of my mind told me that we were being watched. There were no signs of anyone else there for me to be alarmed, so I didn't say anything to the guys. But it was that type of feeling, almost a sixth sense, saying someone or something is there, just outside the light of the fire. I shook it off and decided to go to bed so I could stop freaking myself out or letting them see me starting to be afraid. The next day we slowly woke up and crawled out of the tent one by one. I cooked up some bacon and eggs, which we had brought in our cooler, and made a delicious plate for each of us. Kevin suggested that we go exploring through the woods, and since I love hiking, I was the first to jump out of my seat. We explored for a few hours, drank a few more beers, cooked up some more food, then took the boat out for some more fishing. We fished for a few hours in the middle of the calm lake. The sun was beginning to set, but night fishing was my cup of tea. But again, I got the feeling we were being watched. This time I couldn't help it. I asked my 2 best friends if they felt as if they were really alone out on the lake, and the color from both of their faces faded as they stared at me. Kevin and Buddha agreed they felt as if someone was watching us, and Buddha even said he felt the same way last night, without me even mentioning my feelings of last night. At this point we were all a little worried, but continued to fish because no one wanted to suggest that we leave or go back to shore. It was dark on the lake, with only our small lantern and glowing stick at the ends of our fishing rods. With what seemed like the blink of an eye, we all turned to see a small light in the woods across the lake. The light began to grow to the point it looked like a spotlight in the darkness, not pointing at the spot specifically, but in every direction. We were frozen with fear. I didn't know what to do but stare at it. I heard Kevin mumble, What the hell is that?" I immediately got extremely dizzy, and I believe I passed out. Or I got knocked out, I'm not sure. All I know is everything went black. I couldn't see the light, our lantern, or the glowing sticks anymore. The next memory I have is waking up in our tent. Kevin and Buddha were in their sleeping bags, both with a different pair of clothes on from the night before. I had pajamas on that I didn't even remember packing, and my side hurt like there was a razor blade in it. I got out of the tent, and there was a fire in our fire pit with bacon cooking in the pan. Kevin and Buddha woke up equally as confused, asking me what had happened. I personally had no idea. They both described a similar pain throbbing in their sides. I lifted my shirt to see if maybe I had a pine needle jabbed into me without me knowing, and all of our eyes were fixed on the small, now scarred cut on my side. My mind was racing. I had never got cut on my side, much less long enough ago for it to heal and scar. Kevin and Buddha lifted their shirts to find similar scars in the same location on their bodies. Buddha began to freak out now. Our canoe was tied up. The fire was started with breakfast cooking. Our fishing poles precisely spaced out, leaning up against a tree, had scars on our sides, and we had no idea how we got changed or into our tents. We were terrified. Without looking for an explanation, we packed our things and left immediately. None of us knew what had happened and had no memory after everything went dark. We were too afraid to tell our parents or anyone else. They may even be upset with me sharing this story on Reddit, but I need help. I need to know if this has happened to other people that went camping in the Allegheny Forest, or if this is our own terrible nightmare.
I love camping, especially with friends, as it takes away from the fear factor you inevitably get when it's dark and you start hearing animals making noises around your tent. This was about 10 years ago or so I was around 16, and was with two friends about the same age. We were all male. This happened in the rural countryside of the UK, and we knew a nice secluded spot in the woods with a flat bit of grass. You get to it, and you have to walk along this dirt trail for a couple of miles, and at a point you turn off the trail and go down a very steep hill, which is very difficult to navigate even during the day, as it's so overgrown. From the path, you wouldn't know what a perfect camping spot it is from up there. I should also mention this trail takes you a fair way from any roads, houses and lights, so it's really cut off and gives you that feeling you're really fending for yourself. No cheeky takeaway halfway through the night. So we're all having a great time, as you do. We had a fire blazing before it got dark, and we were cooking off of it, so we had a hearty hot meal before bed. It soon got dark, so we all huddled around the fire and started talking about typical teenager stuff long through the night. It was probably around 1:30 a.m. when we noticed two lights close together, like eyes, coming from the trail, but the lights gave off some kind of light a torch would. Is someone holding two torches in each hand, we thought? We watch the lights for a bit, and it's shining down at us so we can't see what's holding them, but we freak out because we think it could be the police, because it's illegal to have a fire while camping without permission in the UK, or some kind of weird monster. So we watch for a bit, and it doesn't move, and no one calls out. Eventually, we see it slowly moving closer, so we rushed inside the tent and sat still and listened. We didn't hear much, and soon calmed down and figured it must just be someone curious what the fire was and went on their way. But the next morning, we woke up to the tent door open, and none of us had got up in the night and forgot to close it. We looked around and saw the grass had been disturbed coming down the hill, but we were really confused what the person did. I still get chills imagining some old creep just staring at us, sleeping. I still go camping, sometimes alone as well, and I don't worry too much about it happening again. I carry a handheld.
This happened when I was 11. My brothers and I had not long started at our new school. 3 days a week, Mom would drop us off, and the other 2, we had to catch the bus. This day, Mom dropped us off. As soon as she pulled up, I spotted a man standing at the only gate into the school. Apparently, no one thought that was creepy. I begged Mom to drop us off out back, but she was running late for work and wouldn't listen. I waited for Mom to drive off, and I told my brothers, who were 9 and 6, to do exactly as I said, without question. They nodded, and we walked towards the gate. I placed myself between the man and my brothers, making sure I got a good look at him. He was about 6 foot, dark brown hair, tattoo sleeve down his right arm, wearing a black skin-tight t-shirt and camo shorts. As we walked past him, I noticed something that made my heart skip. In his hand, closest to the school gate, was a pocket knife he was flicking in and out. At that point, priority 1 was to get my brothers somewhere safe. I made them walk quickly in front of me to the library. I told them not to leave the library until I came back to get them. Then I made my way to the office through the staff room. My teacher, Mrs. Muddle, stopped me and tried to make me go back out in front of the school to the office. I looked at her and said, "There's a man in front of the school with a knife." She could see that I was dead serious and let me through. The office lady called the cops, who were quick to show up and arrest the guy. Lunchtime that same day, I was called into the principal's office. Before I could ask what I had done, I was always getting into trouble. I was pulled into a hug by some random lady who couldn't stop thanking me for saving her son's life. Turns out, the guy was the father of one of the students, who had been physically abusing the kid and his mother. When she decided to leave him and stop him from seeing his son, he decided that he would kidnap and kill the boy, because he saw that if he couldn't have him, no one could.
My father passed away when I was 4, the summer before I started kindergarten. I don't remember very much about him, but the things I do remember chill me to the bone, and I've never spoken of these memories before. My father built custom motorcycles and owned his own vehicle repair shop that was attached to a small cafe in rural Saskatchewan, just off the American border. We all lived on a farm about 20 kilometers away from the shop. My father worked late hours, so my mother would tuck me into bed every night. I remember trying to stay awake in my bed every night, waiting for Daddy to come home so I could say goodnight. My toddler body wouldn't allow it, and no matter how hard I fought, I would always be asleep before long, but always to wake up bright and early to find Daddy in the kitchen, smiling with a warm hug. One night, I stayed awake long enough to hear Daddy's truck pull up and his door slam. I waited a little while in my bed, listening. I heard lots of banging noises coming from where the truck was parked. I was beginning to get impatient. I didn't want to fall asleep before Daddy came in. I got up out of bed and put my slippers on. I was determined to say goodnight to Daddy this time. I wrapped my housecoat around me and slowly made my way to the back door in the dark. I didn't want to wake Mommy up. I pulled open the door, stepped out into the cold night air, and walked through the grass towards the side of the house where Daddy's truck was parked. Daddy wasn't there. The tailgate was pulled down, and there was something dark dripping from the gate into the dirt below. As I was slowly moving my way closer, I heard the barn door slam shut. Forgetting about the dripping darkness, I ran to meet Daddy and tell him goodnight. When I made it to my father, about halfway between the house and the barn, I noticed that something wasn't right. Daddy had a funny look on his face, and his blue overalls were stained red. I looked at Daddy, but couldn't bring myself to say a word. I was suddenly very scared. Daddy picked me up, carried me into the house, and put me back in bed. He tucked me in and kissed me on the forehead, then left without a word. It took me a long time to fall asleep that night, and I heard a lot of very strange noises coming from outside. I never stayed up to say goodnight to my Daddy again.
When I was a kid, around 8 years old, I took karate lessons at my local mini-mall. Just recalling the events of this story fills me with dread as to what could have happened. So yeah, I remember that my lessons were twice a week and an hour long, and my mom would drop me off and pick me up whenever it was over. Most parents would sit in the lobby and wait for their kid's lesson to be over, but my mom would always go shopping or something to kill the time instead. There was a guy that was in the lobby almost every time I had a lesson. He looked older, probably in his 50s, dark hair, long beard, and mustache. I always assumed that he was another one of the kids' parents, but I never saw him drop someone off or pick them up. Something was strange about this, but my 8-year-old brain didn't piece it together that it was weird that some guy would just hang out and watch kids in the lobby of a karate center. So one day I graduated up to a green belt, or yellow belt, or something, doesn't really matter, and my mom dropped me off at the same time that she always did. However, she didn't realize that I was in a different group of lessons now, and I wasn't able to participate in the class. So instead, I decided that I would look for her in the mini-mall. The guy started to follow me. He came right up behind me and tapped me on the shoulder, told me that my mom told him to find me because my sister was in the hospital. He described what my mom looked like, what my sister looked like, and that I should get into his van so that he could take me to my parents. I remembered that I started to cry and followed him because I really believed him when he said that my sister was in the hospital. I asked him what happened, and he told me that there was a car accident. I asked him who he was, and I just remember he said something like he was friends with my mom. I remember that this didn't sit right with me because my mom never talked to him when she dropped me off, and I didn't recall them ever saying one word to each other. His van was parked a couple of stores down from the karate center by the sidewalk. I remember being something like 20 feet from the van when I looked behind me and saw my mom shopping through one of the windows in a JCPenney. At this point, the guy was holding my hand and leading me to his van. But I stopped when I saw my mom, and he started to pull me and said that we had to hurry. I remember pointing at my mom and saying to him, "My mom's right there." He gave me another tug, and I resisted and started to scream. He let go of me instantly, got into his van, and sped off in a hurry. In that moment, I realized that I was almost kidnapped. I remembered all the stranger danger warnings that were given in school, but I stupidly thought that because this guy could describe my mom and my sister, he must know them. Instead, he must have been watching me and my family for weeks before he decided to make his move. I remember running into the store, tears streaming down my face, and just giving my mom a huge hug. I tried to tell her what happened, but she just yelled at me and smacked me upside the head for missing my karate lesson. She took me back to the karate center. My sensei explained to her that my lessons were at a different time now that I have gone up a belt color. He probably explained this to my mom before, but as you can tell by reading this, I didn't have the most responsible parents. I tried telling my mom about the guy, who said he was her friend, but she ignored me. She said something like he must have thought I was another kid or something. God, my mom is such a fucking idiot. But I was too young to linger on it or do anything about it, so that memory just festered in me for years. And every year that went by, I became a little wiser and a little more terrified of what could have happened to me if I had gotten in that van.
Long story short, I haven't seen my mother in a very long time. Since I was maybe 13 or 14, and between being born and her disappearing forever, I didn't see her all that much based on the fact that she had very little interest in me or being a mom in general. I was younger when this happened. My grandmother got me into ghost stories, and so they didn't really scare me particularly. When I was maybe 7 or 8, I was used to my mom not really paying attention to me, and we resided in a house with her mother where I spent most of my days alone or with my grandma, who was literally insane. She'd buy me things and tell me how sorry my mother was for everything she'd done to me. It was bullshit. It was a dismal existence in that house, and it was my last full day before going back to where I was happy, my father's mother's house. Anyway, my mother looked like shit. She was heavy into cocaine, and she just looks at me. "Hey, you want to go see something cool?" I thought it was that day that her mom said would come, when she'd finally quit treating me like I didn't exist. I just nodded and followed her out to her car. We live in Colorado, and my mother was based in a little one-horse town in Washington State. She hadn't been in Colorado much. She'd come when I was 2 years old, I think. Needless to say, she didn't know Colorado very well. So we got in the car and we began driving. We drove past every single place that I knew, and I asked her where we were going. She didn't reply. We ended up in a tiny town, smaller than her hometown. All the buildings were old, and both the restaurant and bookstore we went into smelled musty. We spent some time in a used bookstore, where she immediately left me and went to her own section. She often just left me alone in public places, and had left me in them a few times, so I thought moms were just supposed to do that. I went to the kids' books, and after a while my mother came and found me and said, "Let's go." Thinking the adventure was over, I got into the car and thought nothing more of it. When I settled in the car and was ready to go over to my other grandmother's house already, she looked back at me and said we were going to that cool place she was talking about. I sat back and waited and watched out the window, and my mother stopped at a very old cemetery. I felt my small chest tighten as my mom got out of the car and looked at me, expecting me to get out of the car. I did so, and like in the bookstore, she wandered off. The huge lot had all big tombstones all sticking out of the ground, so I wandered around for a while and all that. After probably an hour or so of wandering around the cemetery on my own, looking for my mother, she popped up out of nowhere and said she wanted my picture. She put me next to a random tombstone and snapped a picture with her camera she apparently kept in her purse. Most of my life I was terrified of my mother, and when she left when I was 13, she was taken away for something I don't really feel comfortable talking about. However, when I found out that that something was actually off with her, and that she was considered as mentally gone as my grandmother, I can't help but think of what was going through her mind, and what possessed her to bring me to a cemetery in a town I'd never been to. Scary or not to you, it haunts me.
This is a story that I've heard from multiple members of my family. It didn't happen to me personally, but I have no reason not to believe what I've been told. I don't know the timeline or any details about the case, but I know that it's definitely true. I had an aunt who lived in Cleveland, Ohio, and worked for some sort of agency helping convicted criminals rebuild their lives after getting out of jail. I don't know the name of the place she worked, but I know that they were involved in the employment of felons as well as lower criminals. My aunt worked directly with the clients, finding out all the kinds of things that they were qualified to do, what skills they might have, what they enjoyed, that kind of thing. She had a lot of experience talking to people who have done terrible things in their lives, but she never judged them for it or assumed that they would continue their criminality. The agency had to check the clients to see if they were genuinely interested in changing their lives, so most of them just really wanted help in becoming legitimate. She had one client who had a very hard time with transportation. He didn't live anywhere near a bus station and thus had a hard time getting to and from the agency as well as to any job. In the months that my aunt worked with this man, they became friendly, and at one point she offered to help him with transportation when she could. This is how she ended up picking him up and dropping him off at his house. I assume that whatever job they found for this guy was close to where my aunt worked, so she would just take him on her way home. She said that he was nice enough, kind of quiet and eccentric, but nothing too strange. At one point, when she dropped him off, he invited her in for a drink, but their professional relationship disallowed her from doing so. After a while, this guy apparently got on his feet and left the agency, fending for himself. My aunt pretty much forgot about it. After some period of time, I'm not sure how long, perhaps anywhere from a few months to a year or two, my aunt sees this guy's face on television. The police had stormed his house, I think after complaints from his neighbors, and found a horror show inside. He had murdered something like 7 girls and women and hid them beneath his floorboards. According to the forensics, his victims had been killed different times, ranging from very recent to before my aunt had known him. So basically, this guy was actively killing at the time she was driving him to and from his house.
This is less of a creepy one-person encounter, and more of a whole community creeped out by one man. The neighbor in question is somewhat famous for his lawn, an impossibly thick green landscape that he had tended by a company. I'm vaguely aware of him losing it on the landscapers, screaming at them outside. Enough I knew he had a temper. The first real red flag that he might be legit crazy came last summer. He asked a teenage boy in the neighborhood to check in on the house once a day and make sure all the doors and windows were secured and water their flowers. The day they left, though, he left a crazy list, saying the kid had to be there multiple times a day, turning off and on different sets of lights at specific times, and leaving weird chores for him. Also, the kid was not allowed to walk on the lawn, and he had to remove his dirty shoes before walking on the concrete sidewalk. He was never to enter the house, but was to turn off and on the lights from the doorway by means of a stick with a loop on it. Also, he was not allowed to use the garden hose to water the lawn and had to instead use a teeny tiny watering can. The letter implied that my neighbor would have the kid under surveillance and would have pictures if he failed to comply. Basically, the kid's parents called him and said they weren't comfortable with the situation anymore, and while they would keep an eye on the house, the deal was off. They argued over the phone. When my neighbor got back from vacation, it was early morning, and he immediately went to their house, woke them, and tried to pick a fight with them. One of the other neighbors is a retired colonel and came out to see what was going on and tried to settle the issue. Crazy neighbor said that he would let it rest if he was allowed to bare-ass spank the kid. He flipped out when they told him hell no. Sometime after this, another neighbor was at the grocery store when he was concerned by Crazy Neighbor. Crazy Neighbor apparently just talked at him in rapid fire for a half hour. Among other things, he started saying how wives shouldn't have friends, and said that his wife's sister was so fat she broke the toilet seat last time she visited. After this, everyone started talking about how you don't see his wife anywhere. Occasionally she will be out watering flowers, but while her husband is seen out, she isn't. Considering that she used to be a social butterfly, this is weird. During the winter, everyone found pamphlets on their mailbox from the landscaper he uses, along with a note saying it was mandatory to now use this landscaper in our area, and failure to comply will result in being sued. We are private, single-family homes with no homeowners association, so this is patently untrue. During the winter, someone saw his wife and her arm was in a sling and she had a black eye. When they went to ask her about it, he wouldn't let her speak and said she had slid on ice. Since then, there have been a few attempts made to talk to her alone, and all have failed. They've gone so far as to get their church involved and to call a welfare check by the cops when he was out of the house. But if she is being abused, she has been refusing help. Snow was bad this year, and he blew a fit about the snowplows piling snow on his property. So he scattered screws on the roadway outside before they came one morning. Then someone in the neighborhood got a puppy. It's quiet and has a fenced-in backyard. Its owners wake up in the middle of the night to the doorbell ringing. When they come out, Crazy Neighbor is standing on the road at the edge of the property. He tells them that the first time the dog gets out, they won't have a dog anymore, and he pulls out a gun and waves it around before pointing it towards the backyard and saying, "Bang." Obviously, they go back inside and call the cops. When confronted, Crazy Neighbor claims he was out for a walk, thought they were awake and stopped by. He says he didn't get the gun out, but it had been on his belt, and that he didn't mean his statement as a threat. He ended up getting some sort of citation from the police. Come spring, he is taken to sitting outside and writing something every time someone walks or drives by. We don't know what, but I have taken to driving differently home to avoid going by him. Most recently, someone put up a swing set in their backyard. They came back from work to find tire tracks through the backyard and the swing set run over and crushed. No one saw anything, but his massive truck happens to have the same kind of tires as the tread arcs left behind. The retired colonel has taken to compiling statements from everyone and keeping records, because we think this is going to end badly.
I recently moved into a new apartment. It's a fairly old building, but the rent is cheap, and it's got its own gym, so me and my roommates were easily sold on the place. We live in a corner apartment, so we only have 2 neighbors. One is a fairly old man, and his partner, and their dog. They're pretty nice. The other neighbor, I only met a week ago. I originally heard about her from her boyfriend. One morning, a Monday, as I head out to the elevator to go to work, I'm asked to hold it by a guy running down the hall. I let him on, and we start the ride down. He asks if I'm new and if I like the place so far. I say yes, and give small answers. Still half asleep, clutching my coffee thermos. The guy laughs and says, "You look just like my girlfriend, Amy. She's barely coherent until she gets her first cup of coffee." I laugh weakly, my still sleepy brain a little annoyed. Yeah, I'm not a morning person. It's clear that this guy's head over heels for Amy, and is a morning person. The 2-minute trek to the street outside our apartment is his excitable gabber about Amy. And apparently, he's planning something big for this weekend. He wants to do something nice for her birthday. We part ways at the street, and I don't see him again. A couple of days later, I'm heading home from work. I just get into our elevator when a girl bursts in behind me. She's in her mid-20s and looks kind of frazzled. I tug my headphones out and ask, "Hey, are you okay?" "Oh, yeah, I'm just..." She stares at the entrance of our building until the doors to the elevator close. I'm getting a bad feeling. What's up with her? She looks scared out of her mind. I ask what floor she would like and if she's okay again. The girl shakily replies floor 7, my floor, and that she is fine. We get out together, and I realize that she is in fact my other neighbor. Trying to seem friendly, since she has clearly had some sort of horrible day, I say, "Oh, I'm sorry I didn't introduce myself sooner. My name is Alice. I live right next door." She shakes my hand, having calmed down some now. "I'm Amy." I smile. "Well, have a good night, and tell your boyfriend I said hi, okay?" My stomach twists as I see what little color has been returned to Amy's face drain away. I don't have a boyfriend. Trying to fish for some realistic explanation in my head, I press on with it. "Your roommate, then. Sorry, I didn't mean to assume." Amy shakes her head. "I live alone." "Who told you that they were my boyfriend?" I explained the meeting with the elevator guy a couple days prior. Amy, now looking sick, hurriedly explains the situation and insists I go file a police report with her then and there. This man, whose name I learn is Dan, has been stalking Amy for over 3 months. He's her ex-boyfriend, and things ended very badly for them. She's been trying to get a restraining order since he's shown up at her work regularly, been making phone calls, and now apparently has figured out where she lives. I explained Dan's plans to do something special for Amy that weekend to the police. We asked if there was any way someone could watch the complex for her that night. This request goes nowhere, and a restraining order can't be taken up yet. And apparently, not enough evidence, and she has never been harmed by Dan. We head back to the apartment. Amy thanks me and says she plans to spend the night and the rest of the week at a friend's house, just in case Dan tries something now that we know he's in the building. Thankfully, nothing happened, and I never saw Dan again. But Amy packed her things and moved out the following week. So Dan the stalker. Let's not meet again.
So yesterday I was at my sister's house with my mom, watching my son and nephews play in the yard. One of my nephews, Harrison, was picking bark off a tree when I remembered an odd encounter I had as a kid. I said, "So weird," out loud, thinking about the encounter. My mom inquired what I was talking about, so I told her. When I was a kid, I was hanging out at the Pinecone Forest, which was what the neighborhood kids called a small patch of trees on the side of the road. I was picking bark off one of the trees to pass the time, waiting for my friend Frankie to finish his homework and come out to play. Out of nowhere, it seemed, a guy came up to me. I could smell him before I saw him. He smelled like stale cigarette smoke. I was kind of scared when I looked at him. He wasn't very old, but he had a very lazy eye that was cloudy, and his teeth and fingernails were stained yellow. My mom taught me to be nice to people, even if they don't look like me, so I faked a smile and said hello. "What are you doing?" he asked me. The smell of his breath was the worst. I'm picking the bark off this tree." "You shouldn't do that. It's like picking off the tree's skin. How would you feel if someone picked off your skin?" he said while lightly pinching my arm with his sharp yellow nails. I don't know," I replied and took my arm back. Just then Frankie's mom called for me out the door and told me to come in and wait inside. I didn't think anything of the whole thing at the time. When I told my mom about it, she had this look of, I don't know, guilt maybe. She said that it's probably time I know the whole story. She thought I forgot about the whole encounter, so she never brought it up to me. First, you should know that the neighborhood I grew up in was a small, tight-knit community. Everyone knew everyone, and there was no reason for an outsider to come unless they knew someone there. Anyway, here's what happened with this guy. Frankie's mom, Sonia, noticed a white van with no windows parked on the side of the road. How cliché, right? She didn't recognize it, but figured maybe it was a visitor for a neighbor. Sonia said, or rather told the police, that the van had been there all morning and afternoon. She was kind of keeping an eye on it. She said she just had a bad feeling. Her house had a huge window in the front facing the pinecone forest, and the van was parked next to it. She saw me waiting for Frankie and kept a constant eye on the van while holding the phone just in case. She saw the man exit the back of the van and walk up to me. As soon as she saw him grab my arm and pinch me, she called the cops. That was when she called me into her house. The cops stopped the guy just outside of my neighborhood. In the back of his van were binoculars, a Polaroid camera, and pictures of me taped all over the walls and ceiling. Me at school, at my grandparents' house, at the bank with my mom. Just me, everywhere I went. But that's not all. He had a key to a storage unit on him. Inside the unit they found a cabinet full of knives. A lot of knives. Paring knives, a butcher cleaver, a thin flay knife, a melon baller, and just various knives of all shapes and sizes. There was also a few anatomy books, obstetrical equipment, duct tape, and 10 empty 5-gallon buckets. In the middle of the unit was an old bed that was used to restrain mental patients, so it had wrist and ankle straps, and the entire inside of the unit was covered in plastic wrap. My mom said he was in a high-security mental institution for the criminally insane, last she heard. So it's pretty clear he had plans for me.
So this is my first post here. I hope this is a good fit. I lurked and read a lot of creepy encounters here. So often people will mention how they give off a creeper vibe. It would be nice if they all did, because this guy didn't. So for background, this guy, we'll call him Pete, is the brother of one of my neighbors. I'm 34, he's around my age, and my daughter is 8 and plays with the neighbor's kids sometimes. Neighbors are relatively normal people. Yeah, they party a bit, but so do I. Pete seemed as normal as anyone. He didn't have the creeper vibe at all. No sweatpants and tank top with random stains. He didn't drive a creepy van. Never made any inappropriate comments. In fact, he kept a neat goatee and was quite well dressed. The few times I've met him, we drank and smoked together, and he just seemed like an all-around decent guy. And then one day, the cops are there. They take Pete away in cuffs, and he doesn't live there. But I guess they had a warrant and knew him to visit there, so that's where they got him. Now I figured it was probably no big deal. Maybe a drug charge or outstanding warrants for some petty stuff. I don't ask because it hardly seems polite to say, "Hey, what did your brother get arrested for?" But it's public record, and I know his name, so of course I checked. And the charge was about as bad as it could possibly be. Child rape. Victim under the age of 13. What in the actual fuck? He didn't seem like that type at all. And I guess that's what really creeps me out. Sick, twisted pedophiles that could easily be mistaken for a normal person. And as the father of a young girl, that scares me more than anything else. The creeper vibe just wasn't there. Anyway, he was convicted and will die in prison. So, seemingly normal super creep kitty diddler, let's never meet again. We won't, and more importantly, no other child will ever meet you again either.
My husband and I live in an apartment complex in a kind of crappy neighborhood. Low-income homes, what have you. There are always lots of break-ins, and it's right next to kind of the downtown area of my city. It was mid-April of last year, and I was about 7 months pregnant, and my husband and I would often go out on our balcony late at night, really just the outdoor catwalks of the apartments, which connected to the outdoor stairwells and hallways. So it was either very late or very early, depending on your point of view, and it was quite dark, and my husband and I were standing outside looking at the moon over the tops of the apartments. He was smoking, and I was unable to sleep due to back pain, the joys of pregnancy. We were chatting about whatever, and suddenly, in the dark before us from the first floor, we heard someone talking. It startled us both, and my husband cocked his head and made a shushing gesture as we both froze. A man's voice, low, was whispering something from the first floor directly below us. I had chills. I couldn't quite hear what he was saying, but it was only his voice, and he sounded like he was having a conversation with himself. As we stood there, both straining to hear him, his voice seemed to be moving away from us. Then we heard the distinct sound of someone shuffling up the stairs. He was climbing the steps to the second floor, slow and deliberately, still muttering. My husband instinctively moved toward me and put out his cigarette as the man rounded the corner onto the outside landing we stood on. He was maybe 35 or 40, but he looked aged in a way I can't really describe. His hair was prematurely gray. He looked really tired at first glance because of his body language, but his eyes were frantic. My husband later told me that he seemed to be high on meth. My husband wasn't a very good kid 15 years ago and had experience with certain drugs. He was also, unexpectedly, walking a dog, a very pretty blue heeler. He walked right towards us, and my husband stepped in front of me protectively. The dog stopped suddenly, and so did the man, as if he had somehow just noticed us. He visibly jumped, then laughed.
Hello? Oh gosh, I didn't even see you there. Pardon me, just walking my little girl.
He had the very definition of crazy eyes. They jumped all over the place, and when they landed on me, they jumped immediately to my big belly in an almost angry way.
Oh, pregnant.
What? I said, sounding like a jerk even to myself.
You're pregnant? Yeah? My wife, well, ex-wife, she used to be a doula. Used to do those things. Used to help out ladies and deliver them, yeah. Babies are great. I have 2 babies. Well, my wife has them. Well, ex-wife, I guess. Yeah.
It's hard to really convey how he was talking. He sounded really excited, but also weirdly desperate. You could tell maybe he wanted someone to talk to. Now I should mention that I'm a filthy bleeding heart, and my husband is a take no shit, look out for number one kind of guy. He cuts the guy off mid-ramble and says, "We were just going inside, man. You have a good night."
Sure, I'm sorry. I'm Mike, by the way. I'm Mike. Mike.
He sticks his hand out, and I shake it. His hands are soaking wet. I almost immediately yank my hand back, and he doesn't even notice. He's taking the dog leash and twisting it weirdly. Every muscle inside of my body is screaming for me to get away from this man. Instead, I tell him my name. At this point, my husband grabs my arm and yanks me towards our apartment, past Mike and the pretty dog. I waddle to the door, and as I open it, look back. Mike is watching me very intently. Once we get inside, we lock the door and talk about him. My husband is insisting he was on meth. He also mentions that it's weird that he's walking his dog upstairs at 3 a.m. when we knew he didn't live in our building. I wrote the guy off as a creepy drug addict, brought our shotgun into the bedroom, and fell asleep. 3 nights later, we are outside again. The building across the street from us is another apartment building, and moments after we walk outside, Mike comes out, staring right at us, walking his dog. He is smiling weird. He's headed for the stairs. We wave and go inside and lock the door again. 2 days after that, I'm getting out of my car at around 4 p.m. and he appears, pretty much at my trunk. 1 second I was grabbing my stuff to get up, and the next second he was standing there. There was no dog this time. He engages me in this weird conversation about how he knows my little girl is gonna be beautiful, just like me, and how lucky I am, how I should never ever get divorced because it ruins people's lives. I can tell he is extremely depressed. He says his daughter and wife left him only a few months ago. My husband yells for me from the balcony, and I make a lame excuse and leave Mike to his weird, jittery self. Husband interrogated me on what I said and warned me to just stay away from him. That night, there's a knock at my door. I check my phone, and it's 3:30 a.m. I have a lot of stupid neighbors that like to get wasted, so I decide to wait and see if they knock again. They do, this time more urgently. Feeling hot, fat, pregnant, and tired, I poke my husband with my foot and tell him someone is at the door. He continues snoring loudly. I resigned myself to getting out of bed. I threw on a robe and trotted out to the front door. Just before I unlock it, I froze. Something told me to check my peephole. An unexplained feeling of dread washed over me. Slowly, I peeked through. At first, I didn't even know what I was looking at. I squinted and tried to focus my vision. Something didn't look right. It didn't look like the hallway. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. The realization that I was staring directly into Mike's eye hit me, and I swear it felt like liquid ice in my veins. My stomach was in my feet, my breath caught, my hands immediately started pouring sweat. I jumped back from the door and started stumbling backwards. I backed into a wall and hit my head. I tried to catch my breath. Mike knocked again and called my name, softly, like he didn't want to wake anyone, like he knew I was there. He probably did. Looking into the opposite side of a peephole will show no clear images, but will show shadows. I turned around and ran into my bedroom, shut the door, and shook my husband awake. He sat bolt upright, and grabbed his shotgun, told me to stay in bed. I heard him tell Mike to leave or he was going to call the police, and then silence. Within a minute, my husband came back into the room and said he was gone, that if I heard anything else to wake him up. I agreed and didn't sleep anymore that night. Several weeks passed before we heard from him. In fact, we'd all but forgotten about him until our car got broken into. The cops showed up to collect evidence, and we told them about Mike, about his creepy behavior, and how we suspected him of doing it. They seemed confused until we mentioned his dog, and then the officer paled. He asked for a full description of what Mike had done. He wanted a statement. Mike got picked up 2 nights after the People incident for aggravated sexual assault on a pregnant woman in her own home, 2 buildings down from us. He had extremely bad PTSD from his time in the Corps, and was also a meth abuser, just as the husband had predicted. So, I'm so glad that I checked that stupid People.